Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Midnight Congregation. The chilling slice of Jenny's words pierced through my slumber. No, please, don't touch me. Her voice, a desperate whisper, pulled me from the depths of sleep. My eyes snapped open in the suffocating darkness of our shared bedroom. Beside me, my wife, Eleanor, thrashed in the throes of a nightmare, her face contorted in a mask of terror. The only sound in the room was the gentle whir of the ceiling fan, a rhythmic drone that did little to calm my racing pulse. Then I noticed it, the blankets at the foot of our bed, a heavy, quilted comforter, lifted slightly, as though an unseen hand were gently tugging them upwards. It wasn't the fan. The movement was too deliberate, too focused. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. A distinct depression formed in the mattress, as if someone or something had settled there, their weight causing the entire bed frame to shift minutely. "Stay back," Eleanor mumbled, her head tossing restlessly on the pillow. Her eyes remained closed, but her fingers, long and elegant, clenched the bedsheets with surprising strength. I felt a paralyzing fear grip me, a primal terror that rooted me to the spot. My throat constricted, as if an invisible hand were choking me. I wanted to scream, to wake Eleanor, to break the spell of this horrifying scene, but my body refused to obey. The depression in the mattress deepened. Whatever presence had invaded our room was growing heavier, more substantial. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the room in a fleeting arc of illumination. Through the slatted blinds, a shadow flickered at the foot of the bed, a darker patch of darkness where no shadow should exist. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the unsettling sight of the blankets, still drawn upwards in that unnatural, taunting way. My hands, now trembling uncontrollably, reached for the bedside lamp. I had to confirm what my terrified mind was screaming at me. But before my fingers could grasp the switch, Eleanor's body stiffened beside me, every muscle taut as a drawn bowstring. "Get out!" she cried out in her sleep, her voice transformed. The fear had been replaced by a chilling, authoritative anger. "This isn't your place. You need to leave." As if obeying her command, the depression on the mattress vanished. The blankets settled back into place, restoring a semblance of normalcy. But the temperature in the room plummeted. It was a sudden, shocking drop, so drastic that I could see my own breath clouding in the frigid air. Eleanor's eyes flew open. She sat up with a gasp, her gaze darting around the room before finally settling on my face. "Richard, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep, but laced with a growing unease. "Your wife is a sheet," I whispered. The words were meant as a nervous joke, a way to deflect the terror that still clung to me. But as I recounted what I had witnessed, watching Eleanor's expression morph from confusion to dawning horror, the reality of the situation solidified. She remembered fragments of her dream, a twisted, distorted version of her deceased grandmother, not the loving woman she remembered from childhood, but a menacing figure attempting to climb into our bed. Sleep was impossible for the rest of the night. We sat huddled together in the living room, all the lights blazing, fueled by strong, bitter coffee and the shared, unspoken knowledge that what we had experienced was no ordinary dream. Something had been in our room that night, something unseen, something other. It was hold its breath and waiting. The following days were a blur of nervous tension. The nights were the worst, filled with a suffocating quiet that felt more menacing than any sound. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Eleanor, increasingly reliant on sleeping pills, tossed and turned, her face etched with a constant frown, even in slumber. She muttered in her sleep, fragmented phrases escaping her lips. "Cold, so cold," and "go away." evidence that the nightmares persisted despite the medication. Driven by a desperate need to regain control, I took action. I installed a motion-activated security camera at the foot of our bed, its infrared light a silent sentinel in the darkness. The first 2 nights, the camera's footage revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the mundane stillness of our bedroom. But on the 3rd night, precisely at 3:47 a.m., the camera's infrared light flickered to life, triggered by movement. My heart pounded as I watched the playback. The blankets, our familiar, comforting comforter, were moving. They rose and fell, not in the random patterns of someone sleeping beneath them, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if a large, unseen entity were breathing underneath. The temperature reading in the corner of the frame, normally a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted to a chilling 45 degrees in less than a minute. I chose not to show Eleanor the footage. Her fragile sleep was already fragmented enough. I couldn't bear to add another layer of fear to her already burdened mind. Instead, I immersed myself in research, devouring everything I could find on sleep paralysis, shared dreaming, and paranormal encounters. Most of it was useless, filled with pseudoscientific explanations and unsubstantiated anecdotes. But one account, buried deep in an obscure online forum, resonated with an unsettling familiarity. A woman in rural Oregon described an almost identical experience. It had begun after her mother's death, she wrote. A presence would sit on her bed every night at the same precise time. It never physically harmed her, but it exuded an aura of intense waiting, as if anticipating some unknown event. She had finally, desperately, sought the help of a local priest who had performed a blessing on her house. The presence, she claimed, had vanished after that. I was not a religious man. My upbringing had been secular, my worldview grounded in logic and reason. But desperation had a way of eroding even the most deeply held beliefs. I found myself dialing the numbers of local churches, my voice trembling as I explained my situation to a series of increasingly skeptical receptionists. Finally, I connected with Father Michael, an elderly priest with a kind voice and a surprisingly open mind. He listened patiently to my story, his silence punctuated only by the occasional, thoughtful Father Michael arrived at our house the next day, a small, unassuming man carrying a worn leather bag. He walked through each room with a quiet, deliberate pace, sprinkling holy water from a small silver vial and reciting prayers in Latin. His voice a low, resonant murmur. When he reached our bedroom, he paused at the foot of the bed. His hands, gnarled with age, trembled slightly as he made the sign of the cross. "There was something here," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the spot where the depression had formed on the mattress. "Something old, but it's not malevolent, just lost. Sometimes spirits become disoriented, especially if they had a strong attachment to a place or a person in their earthly life." That night, Eleanor had another dream, but this time her voice, when she spoke in her sleep, was calm, almost soothing. "It's okay," she murmured. "I understand now. You can go home." The temperature in the room dropped again, but not with the same bone-chilling intensity as before. A gentle breeze, seemingly out of nowhere, stirred the curtains. Felt like someone or something brushing past me in a hurry. Then, Eleanor sighed deeply in her sleep, her body relaxing for the first time in weeks. We never felt the presence again. The next morning, Eleanor remembered more of her dream. This time, it was her real grandmother, the loving woman she remembered from her childhood. Her grandmother, she said, had explained that the spirit wasn't trying to harm us. It was the spirit of a woman named Agnes, who had lived in our house decades earlier. In her final years, Agnes had suffered from severe dementia. She would often become confused, wandering into the wrong rooms, even after being moved to a care facility. After her death, Agnes's spirit had continued to return to what she believed was her bedroom, disoriented and bewildered by the presence of strangers in her space. Eleanor's grandmother, acting as a spiritual guide, had helped Agnes remember who she was, had gently led her away from the house, towards somewhere else. I still have the video footage from that last night. If you watch closely, at the moment Eleanor speaks in her sleep, you can see two faint sets of footprints briefly form in the carpet, then fade away. One set is shuffling, hesitant, the other firm and purposeful, leading the first towards the hallway, towards the front door, towards somewhere beyond our understanding. The footprints is leading to the doorway. We decided to keep the house. There was a sense of peace now, a quiet understanding that had settled over us. But we couldn't leave the bedroom as it was. Felt tainted somehow. So we rearranged the furniture. The bed, once facing the window, was now positioned against a different wall. We repainted the room, choosing a soft, calming shade of blue, a stark contrast to the previous, sterile white. It wasn't about trying to ward off spirits. We weren't afraid anymore. It was about reclaiming the space, making it truly ours. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'd find myself thinking about Agnes, the confused spirit who had once shared our room. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, a lost soul trapped in a loop of disorientation. And I felt a profound gratitude for Eleanor's grandmother, for her intercession, for her kindness in guiding Agnes towards peace. It would have been easy to frame this experience as a typical ghost story, to focus on the terror and uncertainty we had initially felt. But in the end, it wasn't a story about fear. It was a story about compassion, about empathy, about helping a lost soul find its way home. Eleanor's nightmares ceased completely. She slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. The foot of our bed remained undisturbed, a testament to the newfound tranquility in our room. But every now and then, when I'd wake up at precisely 3:47 a.m., I'd whisper a quiet thank you into the darkness, a silent acknowledgement of both grandmothers, the one who had helped and the one who had needed help. Then, I'd roll over and fall back asleep, secure in the knowledge that our room finally belonged only to us. The motion sensor camera remained in place. It continued its silent vigil, its red light blinking steadily in the corner of the room. It hadn't detected any unusual movement in months. The temperature remained stable, the air free of any unexplained chills. The only movements in our bedroom were the ordinary ones, the subtle shifting of blankets as we breathed, the occasional prowl of our two cats, Jasper and Luna, across the foot of the bed, the shadows cast by passing cars outside. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after experiencing something so profoundly inexplicable. We didn't speak about it often, Eleanor and I, but the memory remained, a shared secret that had subtly altered our perception of the world. How could it not? Some experiences, however brief, leave an indelible mark, a quiet understanding that there are forces, energies, dimensions beyond our everyday comprehension. I still woke up occasionally in the dead of night, my heart racing, remnants of half-remembered dreams clinging to the edges of my consciousness. But now, instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the unknown. The foot of our bed was just the foot of our bed, no mysterious depressions, no unsettling movements. Eleanor, too, seemed to have found her peace. She told me she sometimes dreamed of her grandmother, but the dreams were comforting now. They'd sit together in a sun-drenched kitchen, sipping tea and talking about mundane, everyday things. When she woke up, she'd smile and squeeze my hand, a silent affirmation of the connection that had helped us navigate those strange, dark nights. We had learned to live with the memory, to integrate it into the fabric of our lives. We had accepted that there were things in this world we might never fully understand, but that acceptance didn't breed fear. It fostered a sense of wonder, a quiet respect for the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil of our perception. And perhaps most importantly, we had learned that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments, there was always a path back to the light, a way to find peace, even in the face of the inexplicable. The motion sensor camera, a relic of those unsettling weeks, remained. I thought about taking it down, dismantling it, storing it away in the attic. But I didn't. It served as a reminder, not of fear, but of resilience, of the strength we had found in each other, and of the unexpected kindness that had ultimately resolved our haunting. It reminded us that even in our most rational scientific moments, we should remain open to the possibility of the extraordinary, to the whispers of the unseen world. Our bedroom was different now. It was truly our space, filled with our memories, our life. The lingering confusion of Agnes's spirit was gone, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of our shared existence. And if, sometimes late at night, I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, or felt a fleeting chill in the air, I didn't panic. I listened to Eleanor's steady breathing beside me, watched the moonlight paint patterns on our walls, and remembered that every story, even the strangest ones, eventually finds its resolution. Our ghost story, if you could even call it that, hadn't ended with terror or tragedy. It had ended with understanding, with compassion, with a quiet, profound peace. The digital clock on my nightstand continued to glow in the darkness, marking the passage of time. But 3:47 a.m. was no longer a time of dread. It was just another moment, no more or less significant than any other. And that, perhaps, was the greatest peace of all, knowing that even the most haunting moments could fade into memory, leaving us changed but not broken. Life went on in our house, in our room, in our hearts. We woke up each morning, made coffee, went to work, came home, and slept in our bed without fear. The only presence in our room now was our own, and that, we had come to realize, was exactly how it should be. The unseen presence. When Sarah was 27, she enjoyed a night out with her friends in the bustling downtown area. Living alone, she often felt a twinge of vulnerability during late-night returns. On this particular night, as her friend, Lisa, dropped her off around midnight, a profound sense of unease washed over her. Lisa sped off immediately, and as Sarah approached her front door, the feeling intensified, an unshakable sensation that someone was inside her house. She paused at the threshold, a debate raging within her. Was she simply being overly cautious, letting her imagination run wild? Yet the feeling was too potent to ignore. Sarah tried to recall if she had left any lights on, a habit she rarely followed. She was always forgetting, but, to her growing alarm, she realized every light in her house was off, a stark contrast to her usual forgetfulness. Every bulb was off, every lamp went dark. A shiver ran down her spine. Sarah abruptly turned, walking away from her house and around the corner, heading down the sidewalk. Lisa's place was only 8 blocks away, and she decided to seek refuge there. It was a relief to think that she wasn't alone. However, her relief was short-lived. As she walked, the distinct awareness of someone following her crept into her consciousness. A glance back revealed a dark, looming shape, the silhouette of a tall man. The lateness of the hour, combined with the deserted streets, sent a wave of terror through her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. She considered sprinting, but the thought of making her fear so obvious paralyzed her. Instead, she settled for a brisk pace, her ears straining to catch the sounds behind her. The footsteps seemed to match her increased speed, yet the figure wasn't running, adding to the chilling atmosphere. Reaching Lisa's house, Sarah's heart plummeted. Lisa's car was missing from the driveway, and the house was shrouded in darkness. A feeling of despair washed over her. Turning, she saw the man standing on the corner of the intersection she had just crossed, his gaze fixed on her. She froze, locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity before he finally turned and vanished behind some bushes. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah ran. She knew an alternate route home, and she didn't stop sprinting until she reached her front door. To her horror, it stood wide open, confirming her deepest fears. The record store regular. In the vibrant music scene of 1990s Los Angeles, Emily worked at a renowned record store, a haven for music lovers of all kinds. Among the store's regulars was a young man in his early 20s, named Kevin. Kevin frequently engaged Emily in conversations about music, showing a keen interest in her recommendations. One day, during a casual chat, Kevin let slip a detail about Emily's personal life a detail she had never shared with him. Emily initially dismissed it, attributing it to her co-workers, who might have mentioned something to Kevin, given his frequent visits. However, a seed of unease had been planted. A week later, fate seemed to conspire against her. While driving home, Emily's car broke down in the sweltering heat. Forced to walk several miles, she finally reached a payphone outside an elementary school. She called a cab, the relief of securing a ride washing over her. As she sat waiting, the payphone suddenly rang. Answering it, she heard a chilling voice on the other end. "Bad luck about your car. Talk to me until your ride gets there." The voice was unmistakably Kevin's. A wave of terror washed over Emily. He had followed her, trailed her from the car, and somehow discovered the payphone number, a feat in an era before widespread cell phone use. Across the street, a gas station and a grocery store offered potential refuge. She thought of running there, but felt glued to her spot, mortified. Within 48 hours, Emily had quit her job and moved back in with her parents, a drastic measure fueled by the undeniable fear that gripped her. Months later, during a visit to her old workplace, her former co-workers shared a chilling piece of news. A recent kidnapping had occurred right outside the store, adding a layer of dread to Emily's already unsettling experience. The echo of laughter. The first time I heard it, the sound cut through the mundane afternoon like a shard of ice. I was meticulously, as always, cleaning the kitchen cabinets in my small, isolated house on the outskirts of Bangor, Maine. My name is Arthur Finch, and I'd moved here 8 months prior, seeking solace and solitude after a messy, painful separation from my wife, Beatrice. Beatrice used to tease me, not unkindly, but persistently, about my obsessive need for order. The house, after the divorce, felt cavernously empty, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant cry of gulls. The cleaning, the organizing, it was a way to fill the void, to keep the memories, the regrets at bay. I had just finished wiping down the inside of the upper cabinets, the scent of lemon cleaner sharp in the air, when the laughter erupted. It wasn't joyful, light-hearted laughter. It was wrong, deep, guttural, and somehow wet. It sounded as if it were coming from the detached garage, connected to the house by a covered breezeway. The previous owner, a retired carpenter named Mr. Abernathy, had used it as a workshop. My hand froze on the cabinet door, my heart leaping into my throat. No one should have been in the garage. I lived alone. My nearest neighbor, a Mrs. O'Connell, lived a good half-mile down the winding, tree-lined road. The laughter came again, louder this time, more prolonged. It built into a horrifying, gurgling chuckle, like someone choking while simultaneously trying to force out a laugh. A wave of nausea washed over me. It was a liquid sound, a sound that spoke of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept leaning against the refrigerator, a relic from my college days, more for comfort than actual security. The weight of it in my hand felt strangely reassuring. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic tattoo against the silence of the house. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to inject a note of authority into my voice, which trembled betrayingly. "I'm armed, and I've called the police." The lie was instinctive, a desperate attempt to project strength I didn't feel. The laughter abruptly ceased. I stood there, counting my breaths, the silence pressing in on me. My hand, slick with sweat, tightened around the bat handle. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door leading to the breezeway. I turned the knob, the metallic click echoing in the quiet kitchen, and yanked the door open, bat raised, ready to strike. The garage was empty. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the workbench, the neatly hung tools, the stacks of boxes containing holiday decorations, remnants of a life I hadn't yet fully unpacked. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints marred the layer of dust on the concrete floor. No sign of anyone having been there. I checked behind every box under the workbench, inside the small storage closet. Nothing. The side door, leading to the overgrown backyard, was still securely locked from the inside. The windows were sealed shut. Must be hearing things, I muttered, lowering the bat, a wave of shame washing over me. Working too hard. I went back inside, double-checking the locks on all the doors and windows, a ritual I performed with almost religious fervor every night. But the sound, that horrible, wet laughter, lingered in my mind, a discordant note that refused to fade. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I finished cleaning the kitchen, cooked a solitary dinner, and watched a mindless television show, trying to distract myself. By bedtime, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole episode. Stress, isolation, the echoes of a broken marriage. They could play tricks on the mind, couldn't they? Sleep came eventually, a fitful, shallow slumber. But it didn't last. At precisely 2:07 a.m., the sound ripped me from sleep. The same laughter, but closer now, much closer. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. My body went rigid beneath the covers. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the cool air circulating from the ceiling fan. The laughter came again, wet and gurgling, laced with a chilling amusement that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if someone or something was drowning in their own mirth, a horrifying, grotesque parody of joy. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the thin strip of darkness visible under the bedroom door. A shadow flickered across that strip, a fleeting movement that confirmed my worst fears. Something was out there. The floorboards outside my door creaked, a subtle but unmistakable sound. Another laugh closer still, right at my door. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, agonizingly slowly. I lunged for the bedside lamp, my fingers fumbling with the switch in a desperate, clumsy motion. Light flooded the room, a harsh, fluorescent glare that banished the shadows, at least the visible ones. The doorknob stopped turning. The laughter ceased, abruptly cut off, as if a switch had been flipped. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I could feel the pulse in my throat. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I pulled up the flashlight app, the beam a weak, wavering circle in the suddenly bright room. The baseball bat was downstairs, in the kitchen. A wave of self-recrimination washed over me. Stupid, I thought. I should have brought it up. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, the phone clutched tightly in my sweaty palm. The silence stretched out, taut and expectant, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The motion-activated nightlight cast a pale, bluish glow over the hardwood floor. Nothing moved in the shadows. I checked every room upstairs, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, the small, and used office, finding nothing. Then, my heart pounding with a renewed surge of dread, I went downstairs. Every lock was secure. The alarm system panel showed no signs of intrusion. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. I spent the remainder of the night in the living room, every light blazing, the baseball bat clutched across my lap. I jumped at every creak and groan of the old house settling, my nerves frayed and raw. Sleep was impossible. Morning eventually arrived, a pale, watery dawn that did little to dispel the lingering fear. In the harsh light of day, I felt a surge of foolish embarrassment, stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. That's all it was. I needed to get out more, to socialize, to reconnect with the world. Maybe even start dating again. The thought brought a faint, bitter smile to my lips. I called in sick to work, a rare occurrence for me, and spent the day on a mission of security reinforcement. I installed additional security cameras, covering every angle of the house's exterior. I added motion sensors to the breezeway and the garage. I replaced the old, flimsy locks on the doors with heavy-duty deadbolts, their metallic heft reassuring under my fingers. The hardware store clerk, a young man with a bored expression, gave me a series of increasingly curious looks as he rang up my purchases, but I didn't care. That night, I went through my security ritual with painstaking care. Every lock was double-checked. Every camera was tested. The baseball bat was propped against my nightstand, within easy reach. I left the bedside lamp on, a defiant beacon against the darkness. Sleep came in fits and starts, a restless, uneasy slumber punctuated by sudden awakenings. Every sound, however mundane, the furnace kicking on, branches scratching against the window panes, the ice maker dropping cubes into the tray, jolted me to full alertness, my heart racing. 2:07 a.m., the laughter started again. This time, it was coming from inside my closet. The sound was different now, subtly altered. It was still wet and gurgling, still deeply unsettling, but there was a new edge to it, a predatory quality that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. It sounded hungry. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the closet door. It was closed, but I could see movement in the narrow gap underneath, a shifting of shadows that shouldn't have been there. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. The closet door began to vibrate slightly in its frame, a subtle but unmistakable tremor. I grabbed the bat and the phone, backing towards my bedroom door, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped both. The closet door started to open, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to mock my fear. I ran. I fled down the hallway, taking the stairs two at a time, nearly tripping and falling in my blind panic. The laughter followed me, echoing off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once, a suffocating, omnipresent sound. I made it to the kitchen, fumbling for my car keys, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape. The laughter stopped. In the sudden, shocking silence, I heard something else. Something wet hitting the kitchen floor. Slow, heavy drops. Drip, drip, drip. I turned around slowly, reluctantly. The kitchen was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the overhead light. But there, on the linoleum floor, were dark, glistening spots, leading from the hallway doorway to where I stood, frozen in terror. I touched one of the spots with a trembling finger. It was warm and sticky and smelled faintly of something metallic. The laughter erupted again, right next to my ear, hot, wet breath on my neck. I ran out of the house, clad only in my pajamas, jumped into my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the 24-hour diner on the edge of town, its fluorescent lights a beacon of normalcy in the pre-dawn darkness. The elderly waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Doris, didn't bat an eye at my disheveled appearance. She simply poured me a cup of coffee, strong and black, and left me alone in a booth, my hands still shaking, my mind reeling from the night's events. I needed a plan and people. I spent the rest of the night huddled in that diner booth, nursing the lukewarm coffee and trying to formulate a plan. Going back to the house alone was out of the question. I couldn't face that laughter, that presence, again without backup. But who would believe me? Who would take my story seriously? The police would likely dismiss me as a hysterical, sleep-deprived homeowner. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and orange, I decided on a course of action. I called Michael, my oldest and most trusted friend from college. Mike was a contractor, practical and grounded, the kind of person who could fix anything, solve any problem. He'd even helped me with some minor renovations when I first moved into the house. "Mike," I said when he answered, his voice thick with sleep, "I need your help. Something's wrong with the house." Mike listened patiently to my rambling, increasingly frantic explanation, interrupting only occasionally to ask clarifying questions. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He simply listened. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Okay, Arthur," he said finally, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in about 3 hours." Those 3 hours felt like an eternity. I paced the diner parking lot, replaying the night's events in my head, each replay amplifying my fear and confusion. Mike arrived just before noon, his truck pulling into the driveway with a reassuring crunch of gravel. He stepped out, tall and solid, his presence a welcome anchor in my swirling chaos. "All right, buddy," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Let's take a look. We spent the next several hours conducting a thorough, meticulous inspection of the house. We checked every room, every closet, every crawl space. We examined the attic, the basement, even the garage. We found absolutely nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of intruders, no explanation for the laughter, the wet footprints, the shifting shadows. Could be raccoons in the walls? Mike suggested, his brow furrowed in concentration. They can make some pretty weird noises. I didn't argue. How could I explain the feeling of that presence? The wet breath on my neck, the sense of something utterly wrong? Raccoons didn't explain that. Mike, sensing my lingering unease, agreed to stay for a few days just to be sure. We set up makeshift beds in the living room, safety in numbers, a shared vigil against the unknown. The first night passed quietly. So did the second. I started to relax, to hope that whatever had been haunting the house had moved on. Maybe Mike's presence had scared it away. Maybe it had all been a figment of my stressed-out imagination. Then, on the third night, at precisely 2:07 a.m., the laughter started again. It woke us both. Mike sat up on his cot, his eyes wide, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The sound was coming from the kitchen, that horrible, wet, gurgling laugh, echoing through the silent house. "You hear it too?" I whispered back, a surge of relief washing over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. Mike nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the kitchen doorway. "That's not raccoons." We grabbed our phones, their flashlight beams cutting weak circles in the darkness, and the baseball bat which Mike had insisted on bringing inside. Moving slowly, cautiously, we approached the kitchen. The laughter grew louder with each step. The kitchen was dark. The motion sensor light, which I had installed just days earlier, should have activated when we entered, but it remained stubbornly off. The laughter seemed to fill the room now, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its exact source. Mike reached for the light switch, his fingers fumbling in the darkness. "Nothing," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. "Power's out." Our phone lights carved weak, wavering circles in the darkness. The beams caught something moving near the ceiling, a darker shadow against the shadows, shifting and swirling in a way that defied logic. The laughter stopped. In the sudden, suffocating silence, we heard something else, something dragging itself across the ceiling. Not footsteps, not the scuttling of an animal, but a slow, deliberate dragging sound, accompanied by the faint, wet drip, drip, drip of something liquid. A drop of warm, viscous fluid landed on my shoulder. I flinched, wiping it away with a trembling hand. Felt oily. "Run!" Mike yelled, his voice raw with fear. We bolted for the front door, our footsteps echoing in the sudden chaos. Behind us, the laughter erupted again, closer now, pursuing us, a wave of chilling, mocking sound. We didn't stop running until we reached Mike's truck, its engine roaring to life, tires spitting gravel as we peeled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I saw something standing in my doorway, a dark, indistinct shape silhouetted against the fainter darkness of the house. It raised one long, impossibly thin arm, as if in farewell. Then it laughed. We drove straight to Mike's house, a small, cozy bungalow several miles outside of town. His wife, Sarah, didn't ask questions when we stumbled in at 3 a.m., our faces pale, our clothes disheveled. She simply made up the guest room and poured us both generous glasses of whiskey. The next day, Mike, leveraging his contacts in the construction and renovation world, called in some favors. A priest came to bless the house, his Latin prayers echoing through the empty rooms. Paranormal investigator, armed with cameras, recording equipment, and an array of sensors, set up shop, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. An elderly woman, who claimed to be a sensitive, walked through the house, burning sage and muttering incantations, her wrinkled face etched with a deep frown. None of them found anything concrete, The cameras showed nothing but ordinary shadows and dust motes. The recordings picked up no ghostly voices, no unexplained sounds. The sensitive simply shook her head and said the house felt heavy, burdened by something she couldn't quite define. But they all agreed on one thing: whatever was in that house wasn't natural. I put the house up for sale the next day. I couldn't face going back there, not even to retrieve my belongings. Let someone else deal with that thing. I moved in with Mike and Sarah temporarily, grateful for their generosity and understanding, while I searched for a new place, something smaller, something closer to town, something normal. The realtor, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named MS Peterson, called a week later, her voice laced with frustration. "Mr. Finch," she said, "we're having some trouble. There's been no interest in the property." "No interest?" I echoed, confused. "But it's a good house in a decent location. The price is competitive." "It's not the price, Mr. Finch," Miss Peterson interrupted. "The house has a reputation. Stories are circulating about strange noises, wet footprints, mysterious laughter, things like that." My stomach sank. The thing in the house, whatever it was, had somehow managed to taint the property, to spread its influence beyond the walls. So here I am, stuck. I'm trapped with a house I can't sell, a house I can't even bring myself to visit. I drive by sometimes, always during daylight hours, always from a safe distance. From the outside, it looks perfectly ordinary. Just another aging New England home, in need of some minor repairs and a fresh coat of paint. But sometimes, when I drive past at night, I see lights flickering inside, even though I know the power has been shut off. And once, just once, I heard that familiar, wet laugh floating on the night air, a chilling reminder of what lurks within those walls. I keep driving now. I don't slow down. I don't look. But sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that kitchen, watching dark, viscous drops fall from the ceiling, listening to that horrible laughter getting closer and closer. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I wake up at precisely 2:07 a.m., my body drenched in cold sweat, straining my ears, half expecting to hear that sound again, echoing through the silence of my new apartment. So far, it hasn't found me, but I keep the baseball bat next to my bed, just in case. And I never, ever laugh at night anymore. The initial fear has faded, replaced by a weary resignation, a grim acceptance of the fact that I'm tethered to that house, to that thing in some inexplicable way. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, but the memories are too vivid, too visceral. The wet footprints, the dragging sound, the laughter, they're etched into my mind, a permanent scar on my psyche. I've started seeing a therapist, Dr. Albright, a kind, empathetic woman who specializes in trauma. I haven't told her the full story, of course. I've framed it as a series of stress-induced hallucinations, a manifestation of my anxieties surrounding the divorce and the move. She nods and listens and offers coping mechanisms, but I can see the doubt in her eyes. Mike and Sarah have been incredibly supportive, but even they don't fully understand. They've seen the fear in my eyes, they've heard the tremor in my voice, but they haven't experienced the thing firsthand. They haven't felt that chilling presence, that sense of something fundamentally wrong. I've continued my research sporadically, driven by a need to understand, to find some explanation, however improbable. I've delved into local history, folklore, paranormal accounts, anything that might shed light on what I encountered. I found nothing definitive, just fragments of stories, whispers of unexplained phenomena, hints of something dark and ancient lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary New England town. One recurring theme in my research is the concept of thin places, locations where the veil between our world and something else is thinner, more permeable. Places where the boundaries blur, where the past and the present, the living and the other, can intersect. Could my house be one of those places? Could that thing be something that has seeped through from another dimension, another reality? The thought is terrifying, but it's also strangely compelling. It offers a framework, however flimsy, for understanding the impossible. My car, the one I drove away from the house that night, has been acting strangely lately. The engine makes odd noises, not the usual mechanical sounds, but something different. Something that, on quiet nights, sounds almost like footsteps. Footsteps walking downstairs. And sometimes at 2:07 a.m. it sounds a bit like laughter. The Watcher in the Woods. David sought solace and solitude in a remote cabin nestled at the end of a dirt road in central New Hampshire. The area was known for its reclusive residents, people who valued their privacy above all else. The nearest neighbors were a quarter of a mile away, a distance that usually ensured quiet tranquility. David's cabin was a haven, visited only by the occasional curious animal, bears on the porch, deer in the yard, the usual wildlife encounters. Human visitors were a rarity. One crisp spring morning, as David prepared to leave for work, he noticed something unusual. A late frost had coated the rear window of his truck, and upon closer inspection, he saw a message scrawled in the icy film. "I watch you." The words, clearly written with a finger, sent a chill down his spine. The remainder of his time in the cabin was filled with an underlying sense of unease, a constant awareness of being observed. While he never encountered any further tangible evidence of a human intruder, the chilling message lingered, a constant reminder of the potential threat lurking in the surrounding woods. The idyllic solitude he had sought was now tainted by an unshakable feeling of vulnerability. He started making plans to live elsewhere. The tapping neighbor, Jessica, living alone in her secluded house, had developed a temporary habit that would soon prove to be a source of terror. Having not yet installed a cat door, she had taken to leaving the back sliding door slightly ajar for her cat, Midnight, to come and go. A piece of wood or a baseball bat usually blocked the door, limiting the opening to a mere 6 inches, a seemingly safe measure, given the long driveway and fenced backyard. One stiflingly hot and muggy night, Jessica fell asleep while watching a movie, forgetting to secure the sliding door with the usual barrier. A slightly open curtain allowed a welcome breeze to circulate through the room. Within an hour, a persistent, repetitive tapping at the window jolted her awake. Trying to maintain the pretense of sleep, she cautiously peeked, hoping to see a branch swaying against the glass. Instead, she saw a man standing outside, his gaze fixed on her through the window. The realization that the sliding door, a mere 6 feet away, was unsecured sent a wave of panic through her. A dilemma presented itself. Confront the man and try to bluff her way into locking the door, or continue feigning sleep and risk him discovering the unlocked entrance. The tapping continued, relentless and unnerving, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 minutes. Jessica decided to act. She rose, making her way towards the back door. The man, her neighbor, Mr. Peterson, stopped tapping and met her there. Just before Jessica could slam the door shut, he uttered a chillingly casual question. "What are you watching?" Startled, she responded, Inkheart. Can I join you?" "No," Jessica firmly replied, shutting the door and peering through the window to watch him walk away. That night marked the end of her open-door habit and the beginning of a heightened sense of caution. She would never leave the door unlocked again. The death rattle. 7-year-old Olivia was home sick from school, battling a nasty cold or flu. Her parents, both at work, had arranged for her grandmother, Eleanor, a spry woman nearing 80, to keep her company. Olivia was resting in bed, while Eleanor was somewhere else in the spacious house. Suddenly, the cleaning lady, Mrs. Davison, entered Olivia's bedroom. She sat down heavily on the chair by Olivia's desk, her breathing labored and ragged. Mrs. Davison managed a weak, "Are you feeling any better, dear?" before collapsing sideways onto the desk, her head hitting the surface with a sickening thud. She ended up sprawled awkwardly beneath the table, her head twisted at an unnatural angle. Terror gripped Olivia. She waited, frozen, for a moment or two before cautiously approaching the motionless figure. Just as she neared, She heard a sound she would later learn was called the death rattle, a gurgling, choking noise that emanated from deep within Mrs. Davison's chest. A small amount of vomit escaped her lips. Olivia, panicked and overwhelmed, ran to find her grandmother. Eleanor, upon seeing the scene, swiftly ushered Olivia to a neighbor's house, where she remained until the end of the day, shielded from the grim reality unfolding within her own home. Olivia knew, with a child's intuition, that Mrs. Davison had died. However, her parents maintained a facade for at least a decade, pretending that the cleaning lady had merely fainted. The event left an indelible scar on Olivia's young mind, prompting a swift move from that bedroom. Her younger brother, too young to comprehend the tragedy, inherited the room. But for Olivia, the image of Mrs. Davison's awkward fall and the disturbing sounds she made remained vivid and haunting, a chilling memory etched forever in her mind. The sights and smells still haunted her to this day. The tapping on the window. Years ago, young Michael's parents made a significant renovation to their home, converting the garage into an expansive playroom. This became the central hub for family entertainment, a space filled with games and laughter. At the age of 10, Michael found himself home alone for only the second or third time, his siblings away for various reasons. Naturally, he reveled in the freedom, staying up late into the night, immersed in the world of PlayStation 2. As the night wore on, a subtle tapping sound began to intrude upon his gaming. Initially, he dismissed it as part of the game's soundtrack, but it persisted, a rhythmic drumming of fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, for relentlessly repeating. The sound grew more noticeable when the doorknob rattled, and the tapping shifted to the door itself, amplifying its intensity. Fear gripped Michael. He stealthily approached the door, double-checking the locks. To his dismay, both were unlocked, although the door had a tendency to jam, making it difficult to open without deliberate effort. He loudly engaged both locks, intending to signal to the unseen presence that entry was impossible. But then a gruff, older man's laugh echoed from outside, followed by the tapping sound, now louder and closer, right outside the window. A chilling phrase pierced the night. "Let me in!" Panic seized Michael. He extinguished the light, fleeing to his room and hiding in the impenetrable darkness until his parents returned hours later. He recounted the terrifying experience, and they searched the house and grounds, finding no trace of the intruder. The event remained an unsolved mystery, a source of lingering fear that the unseen visitor might one day return when he was home alone. The sound still echoes to this day. The stairwell watcher. The heat was the first sign. It pressed against my back, a palpable wave of warmth, like standing too close to an open oven. I was scraping away decades-old wallpaper from the wall next to the attic stairs in the house I'd inherited from my great-aunt Mildred. I turned around, expecting to find a malfunctioning space heater or a draft from a broken window. Nothing, just the empty hallway, bathed in the pale afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows and the worn, wooden steps leading upwards to the attic. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the exertion of the renovation work. I'd been at it for hours, stripping away layers of floral patterns and faded stripes, uncovering the bare plaster beneath. It was tedious, dusty work, but it was necessary. The house, a sprawling Victorian in a quiet suburb of Providence, Rhode Island, needed a complete overhaul before I could even think about selling it. I went back to work, my scraper digging into the stubborn wallpaper. The heat returned, stronger this time, accompanied by a distinct pressure between my shoulder blades, as if someone were standing directly behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around again, faster this time, my heart rate kicking up a notch. Still nothing. The hallway remained empty, silent except for the rustling of the leaves outside. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, I'm sitting at my kitchen table at 3 a.m., staring at a stack of old family photographs I found in the attic, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold a pen. The photos, brittle and faded, are spread out before me like a morbid jigsaw puzzle, and I can't stop seeing it. Mildred had left me the house unexpectedly. She'd been the family recluse, the eccentric aunt who lived alone, surrounded by cats and stacks of books. I'd only met her a handful of times as a child, and my memories were hazy. A dimly lit house filled with the scent of mothballs and lavender. A frail woman with piercing blue eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. The house was in a state of disrepair. The wiring was ancient, the plumbing leaky, and every surface was coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. But the property values in the area were soaring, and I, recently laid off from my job as a software engineer, saw it as an opportunity. I could fix it up, sell it, and use the profit to start my own business. The first 2 weeks of the renovation were straightforward. I replaced faulty wiring, patched holes in the plaster, and started the arduous task of stripping away the layers of wallpaper. Then came that day by the attic stairs. After the second time I felt the heat and pressure, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses were full of drafts, I told myself. The uneven heating system was probably to blame. But the sensation persisted, always in the same location, always with the same intensity. It felt personal, like something was watching me, specifically from those stairs. I started avoiding that section of the hallway, taking circuitous routes to reach other rooms. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the unease remained, a constant, nagging presence at the back of my mind. Last night, I finally forced myself to confront my fear. I needed to check the attic insulation anyway, and I was tired of letting this thing dictate my movements. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and a toolbox and started up the stairs. The heat hit me halfway up, a suffocating wave that made my shirt instantly stick to my back. The pressure followed, so intense I had to grip the railing to keep from stumbling backward. My flashlight beam danced across dusty boxes, discarded furniture, and piles of yellowing newspapers. The air was thick with the scent of decay and dust. I pushed through the discomfort, determined to reach the top. The attic was vast, running the entire length of the house. It was a repository of forgotten memories, trunks overflowing with old clothes, sheet-covered furniture, stacks of magazines and books. I spotted a cardboard box labeled "Family Photos Mildred" and grabbed it, hoping to find some clues about the house's history, something that might guide my renovation efforts. The box was a treasure trove of images, spanning decades. Most were typical family portraits, stiffly posed groups in front of outdated cars, children grinning toothlessly on Christmas morning, awkward teenagers at prom. But then, I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph of the attic stairs, taken from the hallway below. The image was faded and slightly blurry, probably from the 1970s, judging by the hideous avocado green appliances visible in the kitchen. But what caught my eye, what made my heart seize in my chest, was the dark figure standing halfway up the stairs. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But the more I stared, the more distinct it became. It was undeniably human-shaped, but completely black, like a silhouette cut from construction paper. There were no features, no details, just a solid, opaque darkness. And it was facing down towards the camera, as if watching whoever had taken the picture. My hands started shaking. I frantically searched through the rest of the photos, my breath catching in my throat with each new discovery. There were more, many more. Different years, different times of day, different angles. But in every single photograph of those stairs, the dark figure was there. Always in the same spot, always facing down. I found a photo dated 1962, showing a family gathering. The stairs were visible in the background, and there it was, the figure, lurking in the shadows. Another photo, from 1975, showed Mildred's birthday party. The figure stood on the stairs behind the celebrating group, a silent, ominous presence. A Christmas morning photo from 1989, the figure was there, watching the children open presents, a dark counterpoint to the festive scene. Some of the photos had notes scribbled on the back, mostly just dates and names. But one caught my eye. It was another shot of the stairs, this one from 1983. Mildred's handwriting, spidery and faint. Red. It never leaves that spot. I've learned to live with it. I spent the next few hours arranging the photos on the kitchen table, creating a chronological timeline. The figure first appeared in photos from 1960, the year Mildred moved into the house. It was present in every subsequent photograph of the stairs, without exception. Always the same position, always watching. My rational mind struggled to find explanations. A defect in the camera? A prank played by Mildred, stretching across decades? But I knew what I'd felt on those stairs, the heat, the pressure, the undeniable sensation of being observed. I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery. 2 weeks ago, I'd taken some before pictures to document the renovation progress. I scrolled through the images of the hallway and stairs. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. There it was, the same dark figure. In my photos, in my digital 21st century photos. The sound of creaking wood, coming from upstairs, made me jump. It was the attic stairs. I sat frozen, every muscle tense, listening. The creaking came again, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight on old, worn boards. The kitchen, which had felt relatively normal just moments before, suddenly seemed too exposed, too vulnerable. I grabbed the stack of photos and my phone and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I even shoved a heavy chair under the doorknob, a futile but instinctive gesture of defense. That was 4 hours ago. I haven't heard any more noises, but I can't bring myself to leave the room. I keep staring at the photos, spread out across my bed like a macabre deck of cards, trying to make sense of them, trying to understand what has been watching me from those attic stairs. The oldest photos, the ones from before Mildred moved in, show the house in its original state, a grand Victorian, newly built in the 1920s. There's no figure on the stairs in those images, nothing unusual at all. But something changed in 1960. What happened that year? What brought that thing here? I pull up my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching through online property records, old newspaper archives, anything that might shed light on the house's history. The records show that Mildred purchased the house in 1960 from the original owners, a family named Henderson. They'd lived there for almost 40 years, seemingly without incident. No reports of strange occurrences, no unexplained deaths, nothing that would suggest a haunting. So the change was linked to Mildred. I dig deeper into her life, searching for any clue, any hint of what might have triggered the appearance of the figure. Mildred was a nurse at the local hospital, Providence General, from 1955 to 1985. She never married, lived alone, kept to herself. A quiet, unremarkable life according to the few records I can find. Then, I stumble upon an article from 1960, a small local news item about a fire at Providence General. 3 people died in the blaze, including a patient named Elias Thorne, who was trapped in his room on the 3rd floor. My heart starts to pound as I read further. Thorne had been a long-term patient, paralyzed from the waist down after a construction accident. He was under Mildred's care. According to the article, Mildred had tried to reach him during the fire, but had been forced back by the intense heat and smoke. She'd watched, helpless, from the stairwell as his room burned. The stairwell. I think about the figure on my attic stairs, the way it always faces down as if watching something below. The heat I feel whenever I get close, the crushing pressure, like someone desperately trying to move, to push through an invisible barrier. The sun is starting to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and pink. In a few hours, I'm supposed to meet with a contractor to discuss replacing the outdated electrical wiring in the upstairs hallway. Part of me wants to cancel, to sell the house immediately, to run as far away from this place as possible. But another part of me, a stubborn, inquisitive part, keeps thinking about Mildred's note. I've learned to live with it. She stayed in this house for over 50 years, sharing it with whatever lurks on those stairs. Did she feel guilty about not saving Elias Thorne? Did she understand that his presence wasn't meant to be menacing, but rather a lingering echo of that tragic night. I look at the most recent photo I took, the one on my phone. The figure is there, clearer than ever, but in the soft morning light, it doesn't seem as frightening. It looks patient, like it's been standing guard all these years, keeping a silent vigil on those steps. I get up and walk to my bedroom door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. I can hear the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of old wood. But now there's something else, a subtle presence I hadn't noticed before. Not fear exactly, but awareness, acknowledgement. I unlock the door and step into the hallway. The attic stairs are visible at the end, bathed in the soft morning light. I take a deep breath and start walking towards them. The heat begins almost immediately, but I don't flinch. I don't fight it. I let it wash over me. The pressure builds between my shoulder blades, a heavy, familiar weight. I let it come. I stop at the bottom of the stairs and look up. I can't see anything unusual, but I know it's there. Watching, waiting. Good morning, I say quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to an empty staircase. I'm going to be working on the wiring today. I hope that's okay. The pressure on my back eases, subtly but perceptibly. The heat softens, becoming a gentle warmth, like sunlight through a window. I take that as a yes. I've been in this house for 6 months now. The renovation is almost complete, but I'm not sure I want to sell anymore. There's something about this place, about the presence that shares it with me. Maybe that's why Mildred left it to me, a distant relative she barely knew. Maybe she knew I'd understand eventually. I head to the kitchen to make coffee, already planning my work for the day. The stairs creak behind me, but I don't turn around. Some things I'm learning are better left unobserved. Some presences are meant to be felt, not seen. The figure will be there when I pass the stairs again, standing its eternal watch. The heat will come and the pressure, and I'll know I'm not alone in this house. It's not exactly comfort, but it's something close to it. A shared vigil, a quiet understanding. I pour my coffee and look out the kitchen window at the rising sun. In a few hours, the contractor will arrive, and I'll have to explain why we need to work around the attic stairs, why that section of the hallway needs to stay exactly as it is. I'm not sure what I'll say. How do you explain sharing your house with a shadow? But that's a problem for later. For now, I sit with my coffee and listen to the old house wake up around me. Somewhere above, on the attic stairs, my unusual housemate keeps its watch. The morning light streams through the windows, and I feel the familiar warmth on my back, constant as a heartbeat, steady as time itself. My hands are still shaking as I type this. I need to get it down while it's fresh in my mind, while I can still remember every detail. It's a way of processing, of making sense of something that defies logic. I'm not sure what the future holds for me and this house, for me and the stairwell watcher. But I know one thing. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm curious. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The contractor is here. Time to get to work. The screaming door. Last year, 25-year-old Isabella found herself renting a house in a small, economically depressed former mining town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Living alone, she cherished the quiet solitude, especially on the first warm nights of spring. One such night, around 4 a.m., Isabella was jolted awake by the sound of her doorknob turning. Initially, she dismissed it as someone mistaking her house for another. But the persistent turning, the insistent jiggling of the handle, sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Lacking a peephole or a window to identify the visitor, Isabella approached the door from inside and called out, "You have the wrong house." Her voice, though firm, trembled slightly. The response was terrifying. The door began to shake violently, as if something was slamming against it with brute force. Isabella, her heart pounding in her chest, tried again, her voice rising in desperation. "You have the wrong house." A guttural noise, a mix of a growl and a whimper, emanated from the other side of the door. Then, the sound escalated into a series of screams and shrieks, a cacophony of animalistic sounds that chilled Isabella to the bone. Grabbing a kitchen knife, she dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. After what felt like an eternity, a knock on the door announced the arrival of the police. Cautiously, Isabella opened the door, revealing an officer who questioned her about the incident. He then instructed her to close the door and remain inside, a request that heightened her anxiety. Unable to see what was happening outside, Isabella turned off the lights and waited, knife in hand, the silence amplifying her fear. 20 minutes crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, without warning, the living room window screen began to push inward, the curtain rustling as someone attempted to climb inside. Isabella, adrenaline surging through her veins, brandished the knife and yelled, "Get out!" Her voice, though forceful, betrayed the terror that gripped her. Relief flooded her as she heard, "Get on the ground! Show me your hands!" Followed by another horrific wail from outside, presumably as the intruder was tackled and apprehended. A few minutes later, another knock signaled the officer's return. He informed Isabella that the suspect had been captured. The officer, though in uniform, was visibly trembling and pale, his composure shattered by the encounter. The next day, Isabella encountered the same officer, now off duty, in the small town. He revealed that the suspect had claimed his name was Jason Voorhees, a chilling detail that suggested a disturbed mind, possibly fueled by meth or other drugs, a dangerous combination with delusions inspired by slasher films. The unlocked door. Over the past summer, Chloe, a young woman, was living alone in her apartment, situated in a relatively safe college town. Despite the area's reputation, she maintained a cautious approach, always locking her door whenever she returned home, a precaution amplified by the fact that she was a female living on her own. One morning, Chloe woke up to use the bathroom. As she was inside, she heard the distinct creak of the front door opening. Fear instantly gripped her. Carefully, she eased out of the bathroom, her eyes scanning the apartment. To her horror, the front door stood ajar, open about 6 inches. Her heart pounding, Chloe slowly, cautiously checked each room, searching for any sign of an intruder. The apartment was empty. Somehow, the door had been unlocked while she slept, and the gentle morning breeze, which she now chose to call the wind, had pushed it open. For the remainder of her time alone in that apartment, Chloe kept a knife close by, a constant reminder of the unsettling incident and the vulnerability she felt. The mystery of the unlocked door remained unsolved, a chilling reminder of the unknown. She vowed to get a better locking mechanism, even if she had to pay for it. The whispers of Route 23. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m. I remember the precise time because I glanced at it, wondering if Amelia would still be awake when I got home. I was driving down Route 23, that desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the heart of Miskatonic County, heading back from a double shift at the Peterson Tool and Die Factory. My name is Daniel Carter, and I've driven this road hundreds of times, but never like this. Never seen anything like this. The radio was playing some old country ballad, turned down low, just enough to keep me company. The headlights of my beat-up Ford pickup sliced through the darkness, illuminating the yellow center line that seemed to stretch endlessly into the black void ahead. The road was deserted, as it always was at this hour. Just me, my truck, and miles of empty fields on either side. The corn harvest had been weeks ago, leaving only dry, rustling stalks that whispered secrets to the wind. The moon was full and bright, hanging high in the sky like a silver coin, casting everything in that eerie, ethereal light that makes familiar landscapes seem alien. I first noticed something was wrong when my truck's temperature gauge started to plummet. It had been a relatively mild night, maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but suddenly the digital readout showed 42, then 38, then 34. My breath started fogging in front of my face. The heater was blasting, but it felt like someone had rolled down all the windows. That's when I saw it. In my peripheral vision, out of the corner of my eye, something was moving alongside the road, keeping perfect pace with my truck. I was doing about 55 miles per hour, but whatever it was, it matched my speed effortlessly. First, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a shadow playing games in the moonlight. Maybe a deer, running parallel to the highway. But deer don't run that fast, and they definitely don't run like that. I slowed down, cautiously, trying to get a better look. The figure slowed too, staying perfectly aligned with my passenger side window, a silent, unwavering companion. It was running on two legs. That much was clear, but the movement was wrong. The stride was too long, too fluid, too graceful for anything human. It was like watching someone move underwater, except at highway speed. My headlights caught it fully when I swerved slightly to the right, a desperate attempt to illuminate the impossible. The figure was tall, maybe 7 feet, but impossibly thin, almost skeletal. Its skin, in the harsh glare of the headlights, looked gray, but not like human skin. More like wet clay or polished rubber. It wore no clothes, had no hair, just that smooth, uniform surface, reflecting the light in a way that made my stomach churn. Its arms were what disturbed me the most. They were too long, hanging down past where knees should have been, and they didn't swing as it ran. They just trailed behind it, like ribbons in the wind, limp and lifeless. The head was the worst part. It was elongated, stretched back, as if it were being pulled by some invisible force. Where a face should have been, there was just nothing. Smooth, featureless gray. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just that blank, stretched surface, turned towards me, watching me as it ran. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine roared, and my truck lurched forward, straining against the sudden demand. 60 miles per hour, 65, 70. The figure kept pace. Its legs moved in that impossible, fluid motion, a grotesque ballet of speed and silence. At 75 miles per hour, it started to fall behind, but only slightly. That's when it did something I'll never forget. Something that still haunts my waking moments and invades my dreams. Turned its head, that smooth, featureless head, a full 180 degrees, to face me directly, while still running forward. And then, in a single, impossible instant, without slowing down, without turning its body, it veered sharply to the right and disappeared into the dense woods that lined that stretch of road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screaming in protest, leaving long, black streaks on the asphalt. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe some primal instinct, some desperate need to confirm what I just witnessed, to prove to myself that it wasn't just a hallucination. The truck shuddered to a halt. I sat there, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The temperature gauge started to climb back up, slowly but steadily. 35, 37, 39. My breath stopped fogging. The night seemed normal again except for one thing. Where the figure had turned into the woods, there were marks on the road. Not footprints, not exactly. They were impressions, depressions in the asphalt, as if someone had taken a hot iron and pressed it into the surface, leaving perfect, oval shapes in a line, leading straight into the trees. I got out of the truck, my legs shaky, my heart still pounding. I had to see them up close. The marks were about 18 inches long and 10 inches wide. They were deep, maybe 2 inches into the solid asphalt. And the edges were smooth, perfectly formed, as if they'd been molded. I touched one cautiously. It was cold, colder than the air around it, colder than the asphalt itself. My fingertips went numb almost instantly. The trail of marks led straight into the woods. The trees were thick there, old oaks and maples, their branches intertwined, blocking out most of the moonlight. I could see maybe 30 feet in, where the marks continued in that unwavering straight line, ignoring all obstacles, trees, undergrowth, even a small, rocky stream. They just pressed through everything in their path. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling, and started taking pictures. The flash illuminated the marks clearly, their unnatural perfection stark against the rough texture of the asphalt. I took a video, too, walking along the line of impressions, my breath catching in my throat with each step. That's when I heard it. A sound coming from deep within the woods. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across fallen leaves. But fast. Too fast for anything natural. I ran. I ran back to my truck, my heart pounding, my lungs burning. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out, tires spitting gravel, not caring about the speed limit, not caring about anything except getting away. I drove straight to the Miskatonic County Sheriff's Department, the only place I could think of that might offer some semblance of safety. Officer Miller, a man I'd known since high school, was on duty. He listened to my story without interruption, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. I showed him the pictures and the video. He watched them silently, his brow furrowed. Then he made some calls. By sunrise, there were state police troopers and a team of investigators at the scene. They took samples of the marks, measurements, photographs. They questioned me repeatedly, asking the same questions over and over, as if trying to catch me in a lie. That was 8 hours ago. They're still out there, as far as I know. Scientists from Miskatonic University have arrived, analyzing the marks, running tests, trying to find a rational explanation. Officer Miller called me an hour ago. He sounded shaken. They'd found something in the woods, he said. A trail of those same marks, running for miles, straight as an arrow, ignoring all obstacles. Trees, rocks, even a small river. Nothing deflected the path. I'm sitting at my kitchen table now, trying to make sense of it all. Amelia is still asleep upstairs. I told her I got held up at work. I haven't decided if I'm going to tell her what really happened. How do you explain something like that? Something that defies logic, that breaks all the rules of the natural world. The local news is already picking up the story. They're calling it a mysterious vandalism incident, suggesting it might be some kind of elaborate prank. But I know what I saw. That figure running alongside my truck wasn't human. The way it moved, the impossible speed, that blank face, it was something else entirely. I've called in sick to work. I can't face that drive home again, not yet. Not while I keep seeing that smooth, gray head turning to face me in my mind. Not while I remember the way it just changed direction, defying physics, defying everything I thought I knew about how things move in this world. The police want me to come in later today to make a formal statement. They're bringing in some experts from out of state, people who supposedly deal with unusual phenomena. I don't know what to tell them. How do you describe something that shouldn't be possible? I keep checking my phone, looking at the pictures and videos. They're still there, still clear, still undeniably real. Proof that it wasn't just my imagination, that something truly did run alongside my truck last night at impossible speeds. But there's something else. Something I noticed when I was reviewing the videos earlier. In one of them, when I was filming the marks leading into the woods, there's a single frame, just one, where something moves in the background. It's blurry, obscured by darkness, but I can make out that same elongated head, turned at that impossible angle, facing directly at the camera, from between two trees. I've tried to convince myself it's just a shadow, a trick of the light, a glitch in the recording. But I know what I saw, and I know it saw me. Whatever that thing was, it was aware. It knew I was watching it, and for some reason, it wanted me to see it turn into those woods. The temperature in my kitchen just dropped. I can feel it, a sudden chill that has nothing to do with the weather. Outside, through the window, I can see the wind picking up, making the trees sway. But the leaves are moving in the wrong direction, as if being pulled towards something. I'm gonna stop writing now. I need to check the doors and windows, make sure everything's locked. The sun is up, but somehow, that doesn't make me feel any safer. Not when I know what's out there, running faster than any human could, leaving those impossible marks in its wake. If you're driving on Route 23 late at night, keep your eyes on the road. Don't look to the side. If you see movement in your peripheral vision, don't stop. Just keep driving as fast as you can until you're somewhere with lights and people and normal things that move the way they're supposed to. Because now I know, we're not alone out here in the dark. There are things that share our world. Things that can run alongside our cars on empty rural roads. Things that leave marks in solid asphalt like it's soft clay. Things that watch us with faces that aren't faces, moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. I don't know what it was that I saw on Route 23. I don't know if I'll ever know. But I do know one thing. I'm never driving that road at night again. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some mysteries should stay mysteries. The temperature is dropping again. I need to go. And maybe, just maybe, if I'm very quiet, if I listen very carefully, I'll catch a glimpse of something tall and gray, moving through my backyard, its head turned at an impossible angle, watching me with a face that isn't a face. But this time, I won't stop to take pictures. This time, I'll do what I should have done on that dark road. I'll keep moving. I'll keep going. And I'll try to forget what I saw. Because some things in this world aren't meant to be seen, aren't meant to be understood. Some things should stay in the shadows, running alongside empty roads in the dead of night, leaving their impossible marks in their wake. And me, I need to go check the locks. One more time, the switched-off breaker. Miles lived a solitary life about 15 miles outside of town, with no close neighbors. One evening, while waiting for his dinner to finish cooking in the oven, he decided to tackle the dishes. The distant sound of a truck idling outside barely registered in his mind, given his remote location where sounds often traveled surprisingly far. The idling continued for 5 to 10 minutes, then faded as if the truck was slowly driving away, stopping briefly, and then resuming its departure. Miles, focused on his meal, paid little attention. He has a very long driveway, perhaps a third of a mile, so it almost had to be on his property. After dinner, as he returned to finish the dishes, he discovered he had no water. The only plausible explanation that came to mind was a tripped breaker for the well pump, located in a breaker box outside. The box contained a few switches and a main switch, the smaller ones controlling the well pump and an outlet, while the main line to the house bypassed this box. Venturing outside, Miles found the breaker box door open and the main breaker switched off. The realization hit him with chilling clarity. The idling truck had been right outside his house, and someone had deliberately turned off the breaker, likely expecting him to come outside to investigate. They had assumed it would cut off power to the entire house, luring him into a vulnerable position. That night, Miles locked his gate, a precaution he repeated the following morning before leaving for work. The day brought rain, and upon his return, he discovered evidence confirming his fears. Tire tracks showed where someone had pulled up to the gate, found it locked, and then executed a 3-point turn in his driveway. For a long time afterward, Miles locked his gate at night, a constant reminder of the unsettling incident. He also acquired a .357 Magnum, keeping it close at hand, a tangible symbol of his newfound need for security and a stark contrast to the peaceful solitude he once cherished. The whispered warning. It was early evening, the sun having already dipped below the horizon. Young Ethan was downstairs in the living room, engrossed in a television show. His older brother, Noah, was upstairs in their shared bedroom, lost in the pages of a book. Suddenly, an unsettling feeling washed over Ethan, a sense of unease that seemed to whisper of his brother needing help. He ascended the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking under his weight. Their bedroom was at the end of the hallway, and as Ethan approached, his hand reaching for the doorknob, he heard a voice, clear and distinct. "I have to leave now." Opening the door, Ethan found Noah looking at him, a mixture of fear and confusion in his eyes. "Someone was just outside my window," Noah said, his voice trembling slightly. "They just said that they had to leave." Ethan questioned Noah, trying to make sense of the situation. "Were you talking to the person?" he asked.
No, Noah replied firmly.
The only thing they said was that they had to leave. The brothers, deeply creeped out, relayed the incident to their mother, but the event remained unexplained, a lingering mystery. For a long time, Ethan believed it might have been a dream, a figment of his imagination. However, years later, Noah brought it up, his memory of the event mirroring Ethan's in every chilling detail. "Hey, Do you remember that one time when we were kids and someone was outside the window? Noah asked. Remember how he left right when you came in the room? What the hell was that? The shared recollection solidified the reality of the experience, leaving both brothers with an enduring sense of unease and a lingering question. Who was the unseen presence outside the window, and what were their intentions? The bathtub intruder. Around the age of 12, young Sophia found herself home alone, enjoying a relaxing bath. As she rinsed her hair underwater, a sudden awareness pierced her tranquility. When she lifted her head, she realized she could hear footsteps, distinct, purposeful footsteps, moving around outside the bathroom, within the house. Both of her parents were at work, and she knew it was far too early for their return. Panic surged through her. Someone had broken into the house and was now roaming around, their intentions unknown. Sophia was trapped, naked and vulnerable in the bathtub, with no phone or any means of calling for help. Her mind raced, conjuring terrifying scenarios. Would the intruders eventually find her? Or worse, did they already know she was there, waiting for her to emerge? The sounds of the running water in the bathtub must have been audible, a clear indication of her presence. Frozen with fear, Sophia remained in the tub for an indeterminate amount of time, her mind battling between the urge to flee and the paralyzing grip of terror. Finally, a surge of bravery propelled her into action. She waited for the sound of footsteps to cease, then cautiously got out of the tub, dried herself, and dressed. Opening the bathroom door, she peered out, waiting, listening. Silence. From her vantage point, she could see the hallway and the entrance to every bedroom. Building up her courage, she eventually searched the entire house, finding no one. The intruders were gone, leaving behind an unsettling mystery and a lingering fear. Sophia called both of her parents, who were still at work, her voice trembling as she recounted the terrifying experience. The incident left an indelible mark, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of being alone and the chilling reality of an unseen presence within her own home. What the hell was going on? The thumping in the walls. The first thump resonated through the old house at precisely 3:17 a.m. I know this with absolute certainty because I checked the glowing digits of my bedside clock, my heart already beginning its frantic tattoo against my ribs. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like a booted foot striking aged wood, followed by another and another. Someone was walking down the basement stairs in my brother Ethan's Victorian house. Except Ethan was in San Francisco on a week-long business trip, and I, Benjamin Reed, was supposed to be alone in the house. I sat up in the guest bed, my cotton t-shirt clinging uncomfortably to my damp back. The air in the room was cool, yet I was sweating. My phone, lying on the nightstand, displayed a string of missed calls from my ex-wife, Clara, and a pathetically low battery percentage, 12%. I'd forgotten to plug it in again. A familiar wave of self-recrimination washed over me, quickly replaced by a more pressing concern. The footsteps. Thump, thump, thump. They continued their slow, measured descent. I'd arrived at Ethan's place 3 days earlier, after Clara had, for the fourth time in as many months, discovered the empty vodka bottles I'd pathetically attempted to hide in the garage, tucked behind the dusty boxes of Christmas decorations. Just until I get back on my feet, I pleaded with Ethan over the phone, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He'd sighed, the sound heavy with a mixture of exasperation and weary resignation. But he'd said yes. He always did. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A brief pause, a moment of unsettling silence. Then they started again from the top. My hands trembled as I pulled on my jeans, the denim rough against my skin. The guest room was on the second floor, directly above the kitchen. The basement door was in the kitchen. I knew the layout of the house intimately. I'd helped Ethan extensively with renovations 5 years earlier, before the drinking had spiraled out of control, before Clara had started finding empty bottles in increasingly improbable hiding places. Thump, thump, thump. I grabbed my phone, activating the flashlight app, and the baseball bat Ethan had thoughtfully, or perhaps prophetically, left leaning against the nightstand. Just in case, he'd said with a strained smile when he'd shown me the room. The weight of the bat felt reassuringly solid in my grip. The stairs creaked under my weight as I crept towards the hallway, each sound seeming magnified, amplified in the oppressive silence of the house. The kitchen was shrouded in darkness, the moonlight filtering through the sheer curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. The basement door, a plain, unassuming wooden panel, stood closed, its outline barely visible in the gloom. The footsteps continued their relentless pattern behind it. My throat was parched, a desert of anxiety. A familiar craving, sharp and insistent, gnawed at me. A drink, my mind whispered, just one to steady your nerves. I pushed the thought away, a wave of shame washing over me. Focus, I told myself. Focus on the footsteps. I pressed my ear against the door. The sounds were clearer now, heavy. Work-booted feet on wooden stairs, moving with a strange, almost mechanical precision. Down, pause, reset, down, pause, reset. The wood didn't creak as it should have under that weight. The steps sounded wrong. My phone buzzed, a jarring vibration in the stillness. Clara's name flashed on the screen. Not now, I thought, my thumb hovering over the decline button. My battery percentage dropped to 11%. The door handle felt cold and slick under my palm. I tightened my grip on the bat, my thumb tracing the worn spot where the grip tape had peeled away. The footsteps continued their rhythmic, oblivious march. I pulled the door open. The hinges whined in protest, a sound that seemed to shatter the silence. I should have oiled them, I thought irrelevantly, remembering Ethan's casual request from weeks earlier. The basement gaped below, a maw of absolute darkness that swallowed the weak beam of my phone's flashlight. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound had been. It pressed against my eardrums, a palpable weight. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The air rising from the basement carried the faint scent of old wood, concrete dust, and something else, something metallic. Then the footsteps started again, from the top. But I could see the stairs now, illuminated by my phone's beam. They were empty, 14 steps. I remembered that from the renovation. Each one bare, unfinished wood, because Ethan had always planned to carpet them someday. Nothing moved on them, nothing visible at least, but the footsteps descended. Thump, thump, thump. My phone battery dropped to 10%. I took a step down, the wood creaking under my weight, a different, more natural sound than the phantom footsteps, which continued their descent, seemingly passing through me as I descended. No change in temperature, no brush of air, just the sound. The sound. 3 steps down. 4. The basement darkness pressed closer, a tangible entity. My phone light caught the edges of Ethan's workbench, at the bottom of the stairs, his tools hanging in neat, precise rows on the pegboard wall. Everything exactly where it should be. Ethan, the organized one, the methodical one, halfway down. The footsteps continued, their relentless rhythm unwavering. 9 steps. 10. The battery warning flashed on my phone. 9%. The footsteps reached the bottom again, paused, and started their ascent once more. I reached the basement floor. The concrete was cold beneath my sock-clad feet.
Είδε φουργούταν σούας.
My light swept across the space. Ethan's workshop took up roughly half the basement, tables cluttered with projects in various stages of completion. The other half was storage boxes of holiday decorations, old furniture, stacks of Clara's crafting supplies from when she used to visit. The footsteps continued above me now. Down, pause, reset, down, pause, reset. My phone light caught something on Ethan's workbench. A piece of paper held down by a hammer. Ethan's handwriting, rushed but legible. Ben, had to leave for San Fran early business emergency. Make yourself at home, but don't go in the storage unit. Seriously, it's important. I'll explain when I get back. Ethan. The footsteps kept their rhythm. My phone dimmed, automatically adjusting to save power. 8% battery remaining. I should have gone back upstairs. I should have called Ethan. I should have left the house entirely. I should have done anything except what I did next. But I'd spent the last few years making a series of increasingly poor decisions. Why stop now? I moved deeper into the basement. The footsteps continued their relentless pattern on the stairs behind me, a metronomic beat of boots on wood. My light caught more of Ethan's workshop, the tools hanging perfectly aligned on their hooks. Something was off. I stepped closer. Each tool was secured to its designated spot, but the outlines were wrong. They didn't match the tools. A hammer hung where a saw was outlined. A wrench occupied the space marked for a drill. A pair of pliers dangled where a screwdriver should have been. I reached for the hammer. As my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. My breath sounded too loud in the sudden quiet. The hammer felt wrong in my hand, too light, as if it were hollow. Behind me, a new sound began. Not footsteps. This time, it was the scrape of metal on metal, coming from deep within the storage area. My phone flashed another warning. 7% battery. The light dimmed further, casting the basement into an even deeper gloom. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. Something caught the edge of my light, a reflection where there shouldn't be one. Metal where Ethan stored cardboard boxes. I moved closer, my heart pounding. The boxes, they looked like cardboard from a distance, but up close I could see the truth. They were metal, painted to resemble ordinary moving boxes, holiday decoration containers, storage bins. Perfect replicas. The scraping sound came from behind them, regular, rhythmic, like the footsteps had been. My phone light revealed gaps between the metal boxes, spaces just wide enough to peer through. 6% battery. I leaned forward, pressing my eye to one of the gaps. My light revealed more metal beyond walls of it, spanning the space where the storage room should have been. The scraping grew louder. Something moved in the darkness beyond the metal walls. Something big. My phone died. The darkness was complete. The scraping stopped. Then, behind me, the footsteps began again, from the top of the stairs. Down. Pause. Reset. I dropped the bat. It hit the concrete with a clang that echoed off the metal walls. Not concrete. Metal. Painted to look like concrete. The storage boxes scraped against each other as something pushed them aside. Heavy steps approached, not from the stairs this time, but from the darkness beyond the false storage area. I ran. My feet, guided by a desperate, instinctive memory of the layout, found the stairs in the absolute darkness. Muscle memory, ingrained from those long-ago renovation days, kicked in. The phantom footsteps continued their relentless pattern, passing through me as I scrambled upwards, their sound a mocking counterpoint to my frantic flight. My shoulder slammed into the wall, real with this time. I could feel the difference, guiding me towards the top. 13 steps. 14. I reached the landing, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I slammed the basement door shut behind me and turned the lock, the metallic click a small, fragile sound of defiance in the face of the encroaching darkness. For a moment there was silence, just my own gasping breaths and the frantic pounding of my heart. Then the footsteps started again. Down. Pause. Reset. And beneath them, a new sound emerged. The scrape of metal on metal, growing louder, closer, more insistent. It was coming from behind the basement door now. I didn't pack. I didn't change. I didn't even put on shoes. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door and ran, fleeing the house like a man possessed. The sun was rising as I pulled into a gas station, miles away, my body trembling, my mind reeling. My hands shook so violently I could barely plug my phone into the car charger. When the screen finally flickered to life, I dialed Ethan's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice laced with concern. "Ben, are you okay? What's going on?" "Ethan?" I gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What the hell is in your basement?" A long pause. The silence stretched out, taut and heavy. In the background, I could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound, muffled by distance and the phone connection. Footsteps, walking downstairs. I can't tell you, Ethan said finally, his voice strained, almost unrecognizable. But you need to tell me exactly what you saw, and you need to tell me, did it see you? I hung up. I started driving again, aimlessly, desperately, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Ethan's house, between myself and that thing, in the basement. The empty bottles stayed in the trunk, untouched. I needed to stay sharp, to stay focused, because sometimes when I let my guard down, when I close my eyes, I hear them. Footsteps, walking downstairs, over and over and over, and underneath them, growing louder with each passing day, the scrape of metal on metal. Clara keeps calling. Ethan too. But I can't answer. I can't risk stopping. I can't risk sleeping too long in one place, because the sound follows me now. Down, pause, reset. Always the same pattern, always getting closer. My car, which had been running perfectly fine for months, has started making strange noises. Not the usual mechanical sounds. Sounds like footsteps, walking downstairs. I've tried to find a rational explanation. Sleep deprivation, stress-induced hallucinations, a gas leak in Ethan's house, causing auditory distortions. But deep down, I know the truth. That basement, it wasn't just a basement. It was something else, something wrong. And whatever was down there, whatever Ethan was hiding, it's not confined to that house anymore. It's out, and it's looking for something. Or maybe it's looking for someone. I'm writing this all down now, in a cheap motel room in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know I can't stop. I have to keep moving, because the footsteps are getting louder, and the scraping is almost constant now. And sometimes, very faintly, I think I can hear laughter, wet, gurgling laughter, coming from somewhere very close. The echo in the abandoned arcade, the high-pitched, almost manic laughter sliced through the thick, expectant silence of the deserted Starlight Galleria Mall. It bounced off the vacant storefronts and echoed down the empty corridors, a sound entirely out of place at precisely 11:47 p.m. The noise hit William Bill Foster, the night security guard, like a physical blow, stopping him dead in his tracks. His flashlight beam, previously tracing patterns on the cracked and dusty linoleum floor, snapped upwards, searching. Bill wasn't a coward. 8 years patrolling the mostly thriving sections of the Starlight Galleria had exposed him to the occasional rowdy teenager, the rare vagrant seeking shelter, and once, a surprisingly organized group of raccoons attempting to break into a pretzel stand. But this was different. The West Wing, his current assignment, had been condemned. Slated for demolition within weeks, it was a graveyard of commerce, a mausoleum of forgotten trends. Management, in their infinite and often inscrutable wisdom, had requested a final sweep before the construction crews began their preparatory work the next day. This meant Bill, armed with nothing more than a heavy-duty flashlight and a walkie-talkie that crackled more than it communicated, was the sole human presence in a space choked with the ghosts of failed businesses and forgotten dreams. The West Wing had been sealed off for over 3 years. Every store was vacant, their metal security gates pulled down like eyelids over unseeing eyes. Thick plastic sheeting, secured with industrial tape, obscured the display windows, giving the impression of something vaguely sinister lurking beneath. The air hung heavy, thick with the musty scent of dust, decaying fabric, and something else, a faint, almost metallic odor that Bill couldn't quite place. His boots echoed loudly as he walked, the sound swallowed and regurgitated by the vast emptiness. The only other illumination came from the emergency exit signs, casting the corridor in a sickly crimson glow, making the shadows stretch and writhe like living things. He really wished maintenance had left the normal lights on. The laughter came again, feminine certainly, but with a chilling edge. It seemed to emanate from Forever Young, a defunct clothing boutique approximately 30 feet ahead. Bill's scalp prickled with 1,000 tiny needles, and the fine hairs on his forearms lifted. This wasn't the mischievous giggle of teenagers or the drunken cackle of a lost soul. This was wrong. Too sharp, too brittle, too present for this echoing, empty space. He'd encountered trespassers before. Bored teenagers seeking a thrill, filming their exploits for social media. Homeless individuals desperate for a warm, dry place to sleep. But the West Wing was secured. Every entrance was chained, padlocked, and reinforced. Bill himself had meticulously checked each one at the beginning of his shift, a process he repeated nightly with almost ritualistic precision. His flashlight beam illuminated the storefront of Forever Young. The security gate was firmly in place, its heavy steel links forming an impenetrable barrier. The display windows were obscured by thick, black plastic, taped securely around the edges. There were no visible gaps, no tears, no conceivable way for anyone to get inside. Another burst of laughter, closer this time, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. His mouth felt like cotton, his forehead slick with a cold sweat that defied the stagnant, surprisingly cool air of the abandoned wing. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking softly against the grimy floor. "Security!" Bill called out, surprised and slightly proud that his voice held steady, betraying only a hint of the tremor he felt. "This area is restricted. Come out with your hands visible." The laughter abruptly ceased. A profound, unsettling silence descended, broken only by the frantic hammering of Bill's own heart, which seemed to echo in the vast emptiness like a drum. He moved closer to the storefront, his flashlight beam meticulously scanning for any indication of a breach. The gate remained intact. The plastic sheeting was undisturbed, but as he drew nearer, he noticed something peculiar about the darkness behind the windows. It was deeper, more absolute than it should have been. It seemed to absorb light, refusing to yield any detail. A faint scraping sound, like heavy furniture being dragged across a hard surface, emanated from within the store. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, measured. They were approaching the front of the store, heading straight towards him. Bill's hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to his belt, but he hesitated. What could he possibly report? "I heard laughter in a sealed-off store?" That would earn him nothing but ridicule from his colleagues and a permanent spot on the Crazy Bill list. The footsteps stopped, directly on the other side of the security gate. Bill raised his flashlight higher, trying to peer through the narrow spaces between the metal links. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice gaining a bit more strength. "Identify yourself." A soft thud against the gate made him jump back, a gasp escaping his lips. Then another and another. It sounded like someone idly tapping their fingers, one by one, against the cold steel. The laughter began again, but it was different now. No longer high-pitched and sharp, it was low, guttural, a disturbing, liquid sound that seemed to seep from the very walls. Bill, despite his better judgment, started backing away, his hand finally reaching for his radio. Static erupted from the speaker as he keyed the microphone. "Control, this is Foster in the West Wing. I have a possible..." He paused, his mind blanking. A possible what? The tapping continued, now moving across the gate from left to right, a methodical, unsettling rhythm. Then, a new sound joined the chorus, a long, drawn-out scraping, like nails dragging across metal, sending a shiver of pure ice down Bill's spine. "Foster, repeat your last..." The radio squawked, the dispatcher's voice distorted and fragmented. "You're breaking up." The black plastic sheeting behind the gate began to bulge outward, just slightly at first, as if something were pressing against it from the inside. "I need backup in the West Wing," Bill said, his voice now tight with barely controlled panic. "Now!" The radio responded with nothing but static, a hissing, crackling void. It was dead. The bulge in the plastic grew larger, more pronounced. The tapping ceased, replaced by a wet, sliding sound that made Bill's stomach churn. His flashlight beam trembled violently, mirroring the tremor in his hand. "Bill!" The voice was a mere whisper, barely audible above the static from his useless radio, but he heard it. His name, coming from behind that gate. His legs felt like water. How could it know his name? His rational mind, desperately seeking an explanation, offered up the name tag on his uniform. But that provided no comfort, no solace, as he watched the plastic sheeting stretch further, distorting into an impossible, horrifying shape. It was like a face pressing through a thin membrane. Features began to emerge in the warped plastic, the suggestion of eyes, a nose, and a mouth stretched wide in a grotesque, mocking grin. The black material, stretched to its limit, grew thinner, almost translucent. Bill ran. His boots pounded against the grimy linoleum floor as he sprinted back the way he had come. A blind, desperate flight fueled by pure terror. The laughter, that low, guttural chuckle, echoed behind him, seemingly amplified by the empty corridors, chasing him like a predatory beast. The emergency exit signs cast a bloody, pulsating light, turning the familiar hallway into a nightmarish hellscape. He rounded a corner, his momentum carrying him forward, and slammed violently into a discarded display kiosk, the impact sending a jolt of searing pain through his hip. The flashlight flew from his grasp, clattering across the floor, its beam spinning wildly before sputtering and dying, plunging that section of the hallway into near-total darkness. Cursing under his breath, Bill pushed himself up, his hand instinctively going to the throbbing pain in his hip. The laughter was closer now, and he could hear the distinct sound of running footsteps, not the measured, deliberate steps from before, but a rapid, frantic pursuit. They were far too fast, too unnatural to belong to any human. The exit door, his beacon of hope, stood at the far end of the corridor, its red sign glowing dimly in the oppressive darkness. Approximately 50 feet. He could make it. He had to make it. Something cold, something indescribably wrong, brushed against the back of his neck. It felt like fingers, but elongated, impossibly thin, and frigid, like the touch of death itself. Bill summoned a burst of speed he didn't know he possessed, sprinting with a desperate, animalistic urgency. The exit sign grew larger with each stride. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. He slammed into the crash bar with the full force of his body, bursting through the door and into the relatively warm embrace of the night air. He didn't stop running, didn't even slow down, until he reached the security office in the still active east wing of the mall, collapsing into a chair, his body trembling uncontrollably. The overnight supervisor, a bored-looking man named Arthur Jenkins, found him there 20 minutes later, still shaking, his uniform soaked with sweat. Bill, his voice hoarse and unsteady, tried to explain what had happened, stammering about seeing someone trying to break in, that he'd given chase. Arthur, his expression skeptical, simply nodded, made a perfunctory note in the logbook, and instructed Bill to finish his shift in the relative safety of the office. Bill didn't argue. He spent the rest of the night staring at the security monitors, jumping at every flicker, every shadow. He quit the following morning, handing in his resignation with a trembling hand, not even bothering to give 2 weeks' notice. He found a new job within days, daytime security at a local bank. Better hours, better pay, and most importantly, no abandoned, echoing sections to patrol. The demolition crew began their work on the West Wing on schedule. Bill, driving past the mall during the day, would occasionally slow down, watching the giant machines tear into the structure, ripping away walls and exposing the skeletal remains of the forgotten stores. He felt a strange mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity. He never went back at night. He never wanted to risk hearing that laughter again, echoing through the empty spaces. He never wanted to know what truly lurked behind that security gate, what had stretched the plastic sheeting into that impossible, nightmarish face. Sometimes, though, when he was alone in the quiet darkness of his apartment, He would hear it, that high-pitched, sharp laugh, so vivid in his memory, so real. And he would wonder, if he had stayed just a few seconds longer, just a few feet closer, would he have seen what was pressing through that plastic? Would he have learned why it knew his name? Those nights, sleep evaded him. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside, his mind replaying the events of that terrifying night over and over again. He made sure to lock all his windows now. One persistent, nagging detail bothered him more than the laughter, more than the impossible shape in the plastic, more than hearing his name whispered by that unearthly voice. It was a detail he hadn't noticed until the next morning, when, in a moment of morbid curiosity or perhaps a subconscious need for closure, he had walked past the West Wing one last time before submitting his resignation. The morning sunlight, stark and unforgiving, revealed everything the darkness had hidden. The security gate was intact, the black plastic sheeting undisturbed, seemingly untouched. Everything appeared normal, ordinary, almost mundane. But then he saw it. There, on the heavy steel links of the gate, were 5 distinct marks, long, deep scratches spaced evenly apart, like the imprint of gigantic fingers. The metal in those grooves was corroded, eaten away, as if by some powerful acid. And next to those marks, etched into the steel with the same corrosive substance, was a single word: "Goodbye, Willie." The use of his childhood nickname, a name only his family and closest friends ever used, sent a fresh wave of icy terror through him. He backed away slowly, his gaze fixed on the chilling message, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He walked out of the Starlight Galleria that morning and never looked back. He tried to put the experience behind him, to bury it beneath the routines of his new job, the normalcy of daylight hours. But the memory, like a persistent infection, festered beneath the surface. Sometimes, when he passed by darkened storefronts at night, he would quicken his pace, his heart rate accelerating involuntarily. He would find himself avoiding malls altogether, opting for online shopping or small, open-air markets. And he absolutely, positively, never stopped when he heard laughter coming from behind locked doors. They tore down the West Wing the following year, replacing it with a multi-level parking structure. Bill, driving past the site, noticed that the construction had taken longer than expected, plagued by unexplained delays and equipment malfunctions. He heard rumors from former colleagues that the demolition crew had complained of strange sounds, unsettling shadows, and tools disappearing overnight. He didn't inquire further. He refused to park in the new structure, refused to even drive past it after dark. Because sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, people reported hearing laughter echoing from the concrete depths of the parking garage, high-pitched, sharp laughter that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. And sometimes, they said, if you listened very carefully, you could hear it calling names. Names of people it remembered, names of people it was waiting for. Bill changed jobs again several months later, moving to a different city, a fresh start, a place where nobody knew his name, his past, his encounter in the abandoned West Wing. He hoped distance and anonymity would provide some measure of peace, some escape from the haunting memories. But the memories, like the laughter, proved more persistent than he could have imagined. He still checked the locks twice before going to bed, a compulsive ritual born of that night in the mall. He still slept with a night light on, a childish habit he couldn't shake, the darkness behind his closed eyelids still filled with the image of that stretching, distorting plastic. And he still woke up in a cold sweat whenever he heard laughter in his dreams, that high-pitched, sharp laughter, always followed by the whisper of his name, Willie, spoken with a wet, guttural intonation that chilled him to the bone. Because Bill Foster knew something now that he hadn't known before that terrifying encounter. Something that fundamentally altered the way he perceived the world, the way he understood the boundary between the seen and the unseen. He knew that not all empty spaces were truly empty. Not all locked doors remained securely locked. And sometimes the things that laughed in the dark knew your name. They knew your name, and they possessed a patience that stretched beyond human comprehension. He started writing it all down, partly as a form of therapy, partly as a warning to others. He filled notebooks with his account of that night, scribbling furiously, trying to capture every detail, every sensation, every chilling sound. He wrote about the laughter, the footsteps, the impossible shape in the plastic, the corrosive marks on the gate, the whisper of his name. He wrote about the feeling of being followed, of being watched, even in his new city, in his new life. He described the sensation of cold fingers brushing against the back of his neck when he walked alone at night, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps behind him, always just out of reach, always getting closer. The doctors, when he finally sought professional help, diagnosed him with generalized anxiety disorder with a touch of post-traumatic stress. They prescribed medication, suggested therapy, but they hadn't seen the marks on the gate. They hadn't heard their names whispered in the darkness by a voice that belonged to something inhuman. Bill moved again and again and again. Each new city offered a temporary respite, a brief illusion of safety, but it never lasted. The laughter, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, they always caught up. He became a nomad, a fugitive from a fear he couldn't articulate, a terror he couldn't escape. He knew, with a growing certainty that bordered on despair, that it wouldn't matter how far he ran, how many cities he fled to, how many fresh starts he attempted. Because somewhere out there, in an empty mall, a dark storefront, a lonely parking structure, or perhaps even closer, something was laughing. And it was waiting for someone else to hear it, someone else to investigate, someone else to shine their light into the darkness, someone whose name it could learn. He reminded himself, with increasing desperation, to remember his story, to remember the warning, because once it knew your name, you could never truly stop running. And sooner or later, everyone gets tired of running. The fatigue was settling in, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could alleviate. He found himself staring out windows, lost in thought, replaying the events of that night over and over, searching for clues, for explanations, for anything that could make sense of the senseless. He started avoiding mirrors, catching glimpses of his own reflection and seeing, for a fleeting second, the distorted, stretched features of the thing in the plastic. He stopped answering his phone, convinced that the next call would be it, somehow using technology to reach him, to taunt him, to remind him that it was still out there. He could hear it now, as he sat hunched over his latest, nearly empty apartment of the familiar, high-pitched laugh echoing faintly, as if coming from a great distance, yet simultaneously right outside his door. The sound seemed to vibrate in his very bones, a chilling resonance that bypassed his ears and went straight to his soul. Those heavy, deliberate footsteps, too, were back. He could hear them pacing slowly in the hallway outside his apartment, a rhythmic thudding that matched the frantic beat of his heart. Thud, 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 closer, always closer. It was time to run again. He knew it, but the thought of packing, of moving, of starting over yet again, filled him with a profound sense of exhaustion. He was so tired, so incredibly tired of running. The laughter grew louder, closer, now seemingly coming from just behind his bedroom door. The footsteps stopped. A long, drawn-out silence descended, more terrifying than any sound. Then a soft, wet tap, tap, tap on the door, like fingers, long, thin, cold fingers. A whisper, barely audible, yet penetrating every corner of the room. Willie, the final account, a jumble of hastily scrawled words and incomplete sentences, was discovered on a laptop in a sparsely furnished apartment in Seattle. The tenant, William Foster, a former security guard with a history of short-term employment and frequent relocations, had been reported missing by his landlord. His current whereabouts were unknown. The laptop was open, the screen displaying the unfinished document, the cursor blinking mockingly after the last. Desperate sentence. So tired, the uninvited guest. This happened when I was a teenager. My younger sibling, Ethan, who was 5 years my junior, frequently sought refuge in my room at night. He was a sweet kid, and his fear of sleeping alone was something I understood, though the specific reason remained a mystery. Our parents, a bit exasperated, attributed it to an overactive imagination fueled by late-night monster movies and the occasional nightmare. One particular evening, Ethan, with his usual pleading eyes, asked to bunk with me. However, my parents had laid down the law that night. Ethan needed to learn to sleep in his own bed. They warned me that harboring him would result in consequences for both of us. I was a stickler for not getting on their bad side. The fear of their disapproval outweighed my sympathy for my little brother. With a heavy heart, I explained the situation to Ethan. "I'm really sorry, buddy, but Mom and Dad were serious this time. You have to try to be brave." He begged, he pleaded, his lower lip trembling, promising he'd be quiet as a mouse. But I stood firm, a knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. Eventually, his pleas faded into a defeated sigh, and he trudged back to his own room. His small shoulders slumped. To ensure there would be no midnight sneak-ins, I made sure my door was not just shut, but locked. The click of the bolt echoed in the quiet hallway, a sound that felt unusually loud, unusually final. I slipped into bed, the weight of my decision heavy on me. Later, deep in the slumber of the night, a faint rattling sound reached my ears. The doorknob was turning back and forth, persistent, hesitant jiggle. I listened, my heart rate picking up. The rattling stopped, followed by a soft click, and what a chilling click it was. The sound of my lock, a simple bedroom lock that Ethan and I had both mastered picking with bobby pins during our childhood games, being undone. The door creaked open, the faint light from the hallway spilling into my room. I turned, expecting to see Ethan's sheepish face. Instead, I saw a dark silhouette, low to the ground, crawling slowly, deliberately into my room. A wave of annoyance washed over me, quickly followed by resignation. "Ethan," I sighed, "fine, you win. Just get in here. But if Mom finds out, we're both in deep trouble." The figure continued to crawl, its movements strangely fluid, almost unsettling. I expected to feel the familiar weight of my brother clambering onto the bed, the rustle of his pajamas, the small, comforting presence of him. But there was nothing, just the open door and this thing crawling on the floor. A minute ticked by, an eternity in the silent room. I craned my neck, peering towards the still open doorway. All I could see was the inky blackness of the hallway beyond. A shiver of unease ran down my spine. "Ethan," I called out, my voice a little shaky. Silence. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet padding softly on the carpet. I crept down the hallway towards Ethan's room, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed open his door, and there he was, sound asleep in his bed, his small form curled up under the covers. The breath caught in my throat. If Ethan was here, then who or what was in my room? I didn't sleep in my own bed that night. The chilling mystery of the crawling figure remained, a haunting question mark etched into the memory of that night. The shadow on the sidewalk. This incident occurred about 5 years ago, when I was 17, a time when youthful confidence often overshadowed caution. It's a story I've recounted many times, not for boastful reasons, but because the sheer, inexplicable terror of it still resonates with me. It's a stark reminder of how quickly the mundane can morph into the menacing. I held a part-time job at the local Walmart, a sprawling superstore just a mile from my modest home. The walk was usually uneventful, a familiar trek I undertook without a second thought. I didn't own a car, and my parents, trusting my independence, saw no issue with my pedestrian commute. Besides, I genuinely didn't mind the exercise. My shifts were a mixed bag, but the most frequent one was the 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. slot. This meant my walk to work occurred during the daylight hours, a pleasant stroll under the afternoon sun. However, my return journey was always shrouded in darkness, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. On this particular evening, work was utterly ordinary. Nothing out of the usual retail routine, stocking shelves, assisting customers, the humdrum rhythm of a teenage job. As my shift ended, I clocked out and began my usual walk home. Stepping out of the brightly lit store into the cool night air, I traversed the vast parking lot towards the street. At the bus stop adjacent to the Walmart, I noticed a man sitting alone. He wasn't particularly remarkable, just a nondescript figure waiting, seemingly, for a bus. I didn't give him a second thought, merely registering his presence as I crossed the street and started down the long, dimly lit road that led to my neighborhood. The street lights along this stretch were notoriously unreliable, casting a weak, flickering glow that barely pierced the darkness. A few minutes into my walk, a flicker of awareness prompted me to glance over my shoulder. The man from the bus stop was now walking behind me, perhaps 100 yards back. He appeared to be engaged in a phone conversation, his head tilted down towards his device. A small seed of unease began to sprout within me. It was odd, undeniably, that this man had been waiting at a bus stop, yet was now walking in the same direction as me, on a street that offered little in the way of destinations besides residential homes. I subtly increased my pace, trying to dismiss the feeling as paranoia. After all, it was a public street, and he had every right to be there. A few more minutes passed, my thoughts drifting to other things: homework, friends, the trivial concerns of a teenager. Then, the memory of the man resurfaced, and I glanced back again. This time, the sight that met my eyes sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through me. The man was now shockingly close, a mere 2 or 3 yards behind me, and he was walking backward. His movements were eerily silent, a ghostly glide that had allowed him to close the distance without me hearing a single footstep. I froze, my mind struggling to process the absurdity of the situation. He was facing away from me, his features obscured by the darkness. For a fleeting, insane moment, I almost laughed, thinking it was some kind of bizarre prank, a twisted joke orchestrated by someone I knew. But a deep, primal instinct, a cold, hard knot of fear in my gut, told me otherwise. The realization of my isolation hit me with full force. There were no other pedestrians, no cars passing by. I was utterly alone on this dark, desolate street with a man who was behaving in a manner that defied all logic and reason. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by fear. Instead, I turned and bolted. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound of my own frantic footsteps was quickly joined by another, the rhythmic smack of shoes against the pavement, gaining on me. I risked another glance over my shoulder, and the sight that met my eyes was even more horrifying than before. The man was now running, keeping pace with me, his body no longer facing backward. He was a relentless pursuer, closing the distance with alarming speed. I didn't look long enough to see his face, but the image of him sprinting after me, his intentions utterly unknown, was seared into my memory. Within minutes, fueled by adrenaline and terror, I reached my house. The front door, blessedly, was unlocked. I burst through it, slamming it shut behind me and frantically engaging the lock. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling uncontrollably. I peered through the peephole, my heart pounding in my ears. The man was gone. My parents were still awake, their faces etched with concern as I stammered out my story, my voice choked with tears and near hysteria. My father, a man of action, immediately went outside, armed with a flashlight, to search the perimeter of our house. He returned empty-handed, reporting that he saw no sign of the man. We checked every window, every door, scanning the darkness for any sign of our pursuer. But he had vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread and a multitude of unanswered questions. Sleep was a distant prospect that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent shivers of fear down my spine. I imagined the man breaking in, shattering a window, standing over my bed. But the night passed without further incident, and morning eventually arrived, bringing with it a fragile sense of relief. From that day forward, my mother insisted on driving me to and from work. Every time we drove past that bus stop, past that long, desolate street, I scanned the surroundings, searching for the man. but I never saw him again. He remained a phantom, a terrifying enigma, a stark reminder of the vulnerability that can lurk in the shadows of the ordinary. The residue of Ravenwood Heights. The first clue, the subtle signal that something was profoundly amiss at Ravenwood Heights, wasn't the eerie silence or the unfinished state of the luxury apartment complex. It was the single, crumpled candy wrapper Amelia, Amy, Blackwood found tucked into a corner of Unit 4B on the 5th floor. Amy, a seasoned security professional with over 12 years of experience on various sites, from bustling shopping centers to sprawling industrial parks, prided herself on her observational skills. Ravenwood Heights, a high-end residential project nearing completion, was supposed to be an easy assignment, a final, quiet gig before she transitioned to a desk job. Walk the floors, check the doors, deter any would-be vandals or thrill-seeking teenagers. Simple, but that candy wrapper, it bothered her. It was a Choco Blast wrapper, its metallic surface catching the beam of her powerful flashlight. The construction crews had finished work on that section of the 5th floor over a week ago. A thorough cleaning crew had swept through on Friday, leaving the unit spotless, pristine, ready for final inspection. Amy herself had patrolled the floor on Sunday night. The wrapper hadn't been there. She was certain of it. She picked it up, her gloved fingers carefully avoiding smudging any potential fingerprints. The expiration date printed on the back was still months away. This wasn't old trash. It was recent. Amy made a meticulous note in her logbook, her pen scratching against the paper in the otherwise silent building. Tuesday, 11:47 p.m. Unit 4B, 5th floor. Discovered single Choco Blast wrapper in corner. No apparent forced entry. Possible contractor after-hours activity? She continued her rounds, her senses heightened, her mind already working through the possibilities. Could be something insignificant, a construction worker sneaking a snack, the wind somehow blowing it in through a microscopic gap in a windowsill. But a nagging unease, a prickling at the back of her neck, told her otherwise. The building was eerily quiet. Even for a construction site after hours, the silence was unsettling. No hum of distant machinery, no rattle of tarps in the wind, just the faint, almost imperceptible hum of temporary lighting. The air felt heavy, stagnant, with a faint, almost metallic scent she couldn't quite place. It reminded her of something. Old copper pennies, perhaps? She returned to the security office, a small, windowless room on the ground floor, and reviewed the security camera footage from the past 24 hours. Nothing. No one had entered or exited Unit 4B except for the cleaning crew on Friday. The cameras covering the hallways and exterior entrances showed only the occasional security patrol herself. Amy frowned, tapping her pen against the logbook. Something wasn't right. Her instincts, honed over years of experience, were screaming at her. She decided to alter her patrol schedule for the following night, prioritizing the 5th floor. She would find out what was going on in Unit 4B. She always did. Wednesday night felt different from the moment Amy arrived. The air was heavier, charged with a strange static electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She checked in with the departing day shift supervisor, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Frank Miller. "Anything unusual to report, Frank?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Frank just shrugged, his eyes scanning the rows of security monitors. "Nah, just the usual. Bunch of wind rattling some tarps on the south side. Nothing you can't handle, Blackwood." Amy nodded, but she wasn't convinced. The silence of the building seemed to press in on her, a suffocating weight. She made her way to the 5th floor, deliberately altering her usual route, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, listening intently for any sound out of place. The stairwell was dimly lit, the concrete steps cold under her boots. Each footfall echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Reaching the 5th floor, she paused outside Unit 4B. The door was locked, the tamper-evident seal she had placed on it the previous night intact. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Nothing. She completed her 10 p.m. rounds, checking every room in 4B, shining her flashlight into every corner, under every piece of plastic sheeting covering the new fixtures and appliances. The unit was pristine, empty, exactly as it should be. She repeated the process at midnight. Still nothing. The air felt colder in 4B, though, a noticeable drop in temperature compared to the hallway. Amy shivered, despite her heavy jacket. It was at 3 a.m. that she found them. Returning to 4B for her hourly check, she immediately sensed a change. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a distinct odor, a combination of stale sweat and something else, something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. On the floor, near the kitchen counter, lay 2 more Choco Blast wrappers and an empty bag of spicy nacho chips. This time, they were positioned under the plastic sheeting covering the brand new countertop. Someone had deliberately moved the plastic, placed the trash underneath, and then redraped the sheeting, attempting to conceal their presence. Amy's pulse quickened. This wasn't a careless worker leaving behind their lunch. This was something else. Someone was deliberately taunting her. She carefully photographed the scene with her phone, making sure to capture the position of the wrappers and the disturbed plastic. Then she called her supervisor, Frank. "Frank, it's Blackwood. We've got activity in 4B again." His voice, gruff and annoyed, crackled through the phone. "What is it this time, Blackwood?" "Another candy wrapper." "2 wrappers," Amy corrected, her voice tight, "and an empty chip bag." They were hidden under the plastic sheeting on the countertop. Someone's been in there, moving things around. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Frank sighed. All right, I'll call the site manager. See if anyone was authorized to be up there. But I'm telling you, Blackwood, it's probably just some worker leaving their trash. Write it up, and I'll deal with it in the morning." "But, Frank, just write it up, Blackwood." The line went dead. Amy clenched her fists, frustration burning in her chest. She knew it wasn't just a worker. Workers wouldn't sneak into an unfinished, locked apartment to eat snacks, and they certainly wouldn't hide their trash. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Amy began a meticulous search of Unit 4B, far more thorough than her previous checks. She moved every piece of plastic sheeting, checked every closet, peered behind every stack of drywall and boxes of tiles. The apartment was undeniably empty, but the evidence of recent activity was undeniable. She found faint scuff marks on the newly polished concrete floor that hadn't been there before, even after the cleaning crew had finished. She noticed finger smudges on the inside of a window, high up, near the ceiling, where no worker would have had reason to touch. And in the master bathroom, she found a single, dark hair clinging to the edge of the brand new, still wrapped bathtub. It was long, coarse, and definitely not hers. Amy carefully collected the hair, placing it in a small evidence bag she carried in her kit. She photographed the scuff marks and the fingerprints, documenting everything with meticulous precision. She decided to change her tactics. Instead of simply patrolling the floor, she would spend the rest of her shift stationed in the hallway outside Unit 4B, listening, watching, waiting. The building remained eerily silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the temporary lighting and the occasional creak of the building settling. Amy stood motionless in the dimly lit hallway, her senses on high alert. She had turned off her flashlight to avoid casting any shadows that might alert whoever was inside 4B. Hours passed. Nothing. Just as she was starting to doubt her instincts, to wonder if Frank was right, if it was just a careless worker, she heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from inside Unit 4B. It was barely audible, but Amy's trained ears picked it up immediately. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. Then silence. Amy waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She counted to 60 slowly, deliberately. Then she heard it again. A soft thud, followed by another scraping sound, closer this time. It was definitely coming from inside the apartment. She reached for her radio, her hand trembling slightly. This time, she wouldn't hesitate. She wouldn't call Frank. She would call the police directly. But before she could key the microphone, the The door to Unit 4B slowly creaked open. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway, the faint light from the emergency exit sign barely penetrating the inky blackness within the apartment. Amy held her breath, her hand tightening around the grip of her heavy-duty flashlight. She hadn't unlocked the door. She knew she hadn't. The scraping sound started again, closer now, accompanied by a soft, wet shuffling. It sounded like something heavy and damp being dragged across the floor. Amy raised her flashlight, her thumb hovering over the switch. She had to see what was inside. She had to know. Taking a deep breath, she flicked on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of Unit 4B. First, she saw nothing. Just the empty living room, the plastic-covered furniture, the stacks of building materials. Then, her light caught something on the floor, near the kitchen counter. It was a shirt, a cheap, blue polyester shirt, stained dark under the arms, crumpled in a heap on the floor. It was still damp with sweat. Amy's heart leaped into her throat. This wasn't just trash. This was evidence. Someone had been in the apartment recently, very recently. She took a cautious step inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room, searching every corner, every shadow. The air felt heavy, thick with that strange, sweet and sour odor she had noticed before. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Security. Is anyone in here?" No response. She moved further into the apartment, clearing each room methodically, her senses on high alert. The kitchen, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, all empty. But the signs of recent occupancy were undeniable. In the master bedroom, she found an empty water bottle rolling across the floor. In the closet, a granola bar wrapper stuffed into a corner. And in the bathroom, on the floor next to the toilet, a wadded-up paper towel, stained with fresh blood. The blood, that was the tipping point. Amy immediately backed out of the apartment, her mind racing. She called the police, her voice shaking slightly as she reported the situation. "This is Security Officer Blackwood at Ravenwood Heights construction site. I have a possible break-in, Unit 4B, 5th floor. Evidence of someone being injured. I need officers dispatched immediately." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Units are en route, ma'am. ETA 5 minutes. Stay where you are. Do not engage." Amy waited outside the apartment, her flashlight trained on the open doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the distant sirens approaching. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. 2 uniformed officers arrived, their expressions grim. Amy quickly briefed them on the situation, showing them the evidence she had collected: the candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the empty water bottle, the granola bar wrapper, and the blood-stained paper towel. The officers, Sergeant Miller and Officer Davies, took the situation seriously. They drew their weapons and entered Unit 4B, clearing each room methodically, their movements precise and coordinated. Amy stayed close behind, her flashlight illuminating their path. The apartment was empty. No sign of forced entry, Sergeant Miller noted, his brow furrowed. "The door was unlocked when we arrived." "You're sure you secured it?" "Positive, Sergeant," Amy replied, her voice firm. "I checked it myself multiple times during my rounds, and I put a tamper evidence seal on it last night. It was intact when I returned at 2 a.m. Officer Davies pointed to the scuff marks on the floor, the finger smudges on the window, the pulled-back carpet padding. "Looks like someone's been spending some time in here. Maybe a squatter." "Possibly," Miller conceded. "But why for B? The whole building's empty. They could have picked any unit." They continued their search, examining every detail, every clue. They found more subtle signs, a faint indentation on the plastic-covered sofa, as if someone had been sitting there. A single, muddy footprint near the balcony door. A faint, almost imperceptible trail of dried blood leading from the bathroom to the bedroom closet. The closet, that's where it felt wrong. Amy pointed her flashlight into the darkness of the closet. The beam caught something glinting on the floor, a small, metallic object. Sergeant Miller knelt down and carefully picked it up. It was a key, A single, ordinary-looking key with a small plastic tag attached. The tag had a number on it, 4B. Amy's blood ran cold. It was the key to the apartment. The key that was supposed to be hanging on her belt loop, along with the master key set. "Where did you find this, officer?" Miller asked, his voice sharp. "Inside the closet," Amy replied, her voice barely a whisper. "On the floor." Miller turned to her, his eyes narrowed. "You said you had the key to this unit." "I do," Amy insisted, reaching for her belt loop. Her fingers fumbled, searching for the familiar weight of the key ring. It wasn't there. Her heart sank. The master key set, along with the key to Unit 4B, was gone. Panic tightened its grip around Amy's chest. She frantically searched her pockets, her security bag, even retraced her steps back to the hallway, but the keys were nowhere to be found. Had she dropped them? Had someone taken them? Sergeant Miller's expression hardened. "Officer Blackwood, are you telling me you lost the master key set to this entire building?" Amy swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know how it happened, Sergeant. I had them when I started my shift. I checked them constantly." Officer Davies, who had been examining the lock on the apartment door, spoke up. "Sergeant, there's no sign of forced entry. This lock hasn't been picked or tampered with. Whoever was in here had a key." The implication was clear. Amy, the security officer, was now the prime suspect. "Officer Blackwood," Miller said, his voice low and serious, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station with us. We need to get your statement." Amy's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. She was the one who reported the break-in. She was the one who found the evidence. She was the victim here, not the perpetrator. But the evidence, the missing keys, the unlocked door, the signs of someone living in the apartment, it all pointed to her. Or at least it created enough reasonable doubt to warrant an investigation. As she followed the officers out of the building, her head hung low. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Something far more sinister than a simple break-in or a case of misplaced keys. The eerie silence of the building, the strange, sweet and sour odor, the feeling of being watched, it all added up to something wrong. She glanced back at Unit 4B, the open doorway a black rectangle in the dimly lit hallway. For a split second, she thought she saw something move in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of something tall and dark, just at the edge of her vision. But when she blinked, it was gone. The police questioned her for hours. They asked about her work history, her personal life, any possible enemies she might have. They asked about the missing keys, about her movements that night, about her knowledge of the building's security systems. Amy answered their questions truthfully, to the best of her ability, but she could sense their skepticism. They didn't believe her. They thought she was involved somehow. They released her pending further investigation, but the damage was done. Her reputation was tarnished. Her job was on the line. And the unsettling feeling that something else was happening at Ravenwood Heights continued to gnaw at her. She knew she had to clear her name. She had to find out what was really going on in Unit 4B, and she had to do it alone. Amy decided to conduct her own investigation, working independently and discreetly. She couldn't access the building's security footage without authorization, but she still had her logbook, her photos, and her memory. She started by reviewing everything she had documented. The candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the water bottle, the granola bar wrapper, the blood-stained paper towel, the scuff marks, the fingerprints, the hair, the muddy footprint, the missing keys, and the key found in the closet. The key. That was the most troubling piece of evidence. How did it end up inside the closet if she hadn't put it there? And how had her master key set disappeared? She went back to the motel where she was staying and meticulously retraced all the steps on her way to the complex and on her rounds. No keys. She decided to focus on the timeline. She knew she had the keys at the start of her shift. She remembered checking them, as she always did, before leaving the security office. She remembered unlocking the stairwell door to access the 5th floor. So, the keys must have disappeared sometime between her arrival on the 5th floor and her discovery of the blood-stained paper towel in Unit 4B. That narrowed it down, but not by much. It still encompassed several hours and multiple rooms. She decided to focus on Unit 4B itself. There had to be something she had missed, some clue that would explain what was happening. She couldn't officially access the building, but she knew a back entrance that was often left unlocked by the construction crews. It was a risk, but she was desperate. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Amy slipped back into Ravenwood Heights. The building felt different this time. The silence was deeper, more oppressive, punctuated by the faint creaks and groans of the unfinished structure. Amy moved slowly, deliberately, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She headed straight for the 5th floor, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, her senses on high alert. Reaching Unit 4B, she paused. The door was now sealed with police tape, a stark yellow banner across the entrance. Crime scene, do not enter. Amy hesitated. She knew she was breaking the law, trespassing on a potential crime scene. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed were inside that apartment. Carefully, she peeled back a corner of the tape, enough to slip through without breaking the seal completely. She would reseal it when she left, leaving no trace of her presence. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she had left it. The plastic sheeting still covered the furniture and appliances. The scuff marks were still visible on the floor. The faint odor of sweat and something else, something almost metallic, still hung in the air. She started her search in the bathroom, where she had found the blood-stained paper towel. She examined the sink, the toilet, the bathtub, looking for any trace of blood that the police might have missed. Nothing. Then, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint discoloration on the wall, just above the baseboard. It was subtle, almost invisible, but in the beam of her flashlight, it was clear. A dark, reddish-brown stain, shaped like a handprint. Amy's heart quickened. This was new. The police hadn't documented this. She carefully photographed the handprint, then continued her search. She moved into the master bedroom, where she had found the empty water bottle and the granola bar wrapper. She checked the closet, the same closet where the police had found the key to the apartment. She ran her hand along the back wall, feeling for any irregularities, any hidden seams or openings. Nothing. Then, she noticed something on the floor, in the corner of the closet. A small, almost imperceptible gap between the baseboard and the wall. It was barely wide enough to insert a finger, but it was there. Amy knelt down, her flashlight beam focused on the gap. She could see something inside, something dark and reflective. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thin metal probe she carried in her security kit. Carefully, she inserted the probe into the gap and hooked the object, slowly pulling it out. It was a small, silver compact mirror, the kind women carry in their purses. It was old, tarnished, and covered in a layer of dust. Amy opened the compact. The mirror inside was cracked, but she could still make out her reflection, distorted and fragmented. And then, she saw something else. Behind her reflection, in the cracked glass, a fleeting glimpse of a face. A woman's face, pale and gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes. Amy gasped, dropping the compact, clattered on the floor, the sound echoing loudly in the silent apartment. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping the room. Nothing. She was alone, but she knew what she had seen, and she knew, with a growing certainty, that the answers she was looking for were not just in Unit 4B, but somehow connected to it, hidden within its walls, its floors, its very foundation. The missing keys, the strange occurrences, the face in the mirror, it all pointed to something far more complex, far more sinister than a simple break-in. Amy picked up the compact mirror again, her hands trembling. She examined it closely, turning it over in her hands. The silver was tarnished, but she could make out a faint inscription on the back. MD 1894. The same initials and date as the Marlene Davies pickup. Her blood ran cold. She closed the compact and slipped it into her pocket. She needed to get out of the apartment, out of the building. She needed to think, to process what she had just seen. As she was carefully resealing the police tape on the door, she heard it again. That faint scraping sound, coming from inside the apartment. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, her flashlight beam trained on the door. The scraping sound stopped. Then, a soft, whispery voice, barely audible, seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. "Help me." Amy didn't hesitate. She ran. She fled the building, not stopping until she was several blocks away, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't look back. She spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. The face in the mirror, the voice in the walls, the initials on the compact, it all pointed to something connected to the history of the building, to something that had happened long ago. She decided to do some research. She pulled out her laptop and started searching online for information about Ravenwood Heights, about the history of the site, about any previous buildings that had stood there. She found something surprising. Ravenwood Heights was built on the site of an old Victorian mansion that had burned down in 1895. The mansion had belonged to a wealthy businessman named Arthur Blackwood, no relation, and his young wife, Marlene Davies Blackwood, had disappeared the night of the fire. Her body was never found. Amy stared at the screen, her mind racing. The initials on the compact, the date, the fire, the missing woman, it all connected. She dug deeper, searching for old newspaper articles, historical records, anything she could find about Marlene Davies Blackwood. She found a grainy photograph of Marlene, taken shortly before her disappearance. She was a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and striking eyes, and around her neck, she wore a delicate silver necklace with a small, round pendant that looked exactly like the compact mirror Amy had found. Amy felt a chill run down her spine. She was on to something, something big, something that went far beyond a simple break-in or a case of misplaced keys. She knew she had to go back to Ravenwood Heights. She had to find out what really happened to Marlene Davies Blackwood. And she had to find out what was hiding in the walls of Unit 4B. The next day, Amy went to the local historical society, posing as a researcher interested in the history of Ravenwood Heights. She spent hours poring over old maps, building plans, and newspaper archives. She discovered that the original Blackwood mansion had been much larger than the current apartment complex, extending further back from the street. The area where Unit 4B was now located had been part of the mansion's original foundation, specifically the basement and servants' quarters. She also found more details about the fire. It had been ruled accidental, caused by a faulty gas lamp, but rumors persisted that Arthur Blackwood had deliberately set the fire to collect insurance money and get rid of his wife, with whom he was rumored to be having marital problems. Amy found a detailed floor plan of the original mansion. She carefully compared it to the blueprints of Ravenwood Heights, overlaying them in her mind. A chill ran down her spine. Unit 4B was built directly over the location of the mansion's old coal cellar. And according to the floor plan, there was a small, hidden room adjacent to the coal cellar, marked only as storage. It had no windows, no doors leading to the outside, and only one narrow passage connecting it to the rest of the basement. A secret room. Amy knew with a growing certainty that she had found the key to the mystery. Something was hidden in that secret room, something connected to Marlene Davies Blackwood's disappearance. And somehow that something was reaching out, manifesting in Unit 4B, leaving behind traces of its presence, the candy wrappers, the chip bag, the sweaty shirt, the blood, the footprints, the missing keys, and the voice. She had to get back into Ravenwood Heights. She had to find that secret room. This time, she wouldn't go alone. She contacted a former colleague, a private investigator named Jack Reynolds, who had experience with cold cases and unusual situations. She explained everything, showing him her photos, her notes, the newspaper clippings, and the silver compact. Jack, initially skeptical, listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious as Amy laid out her evidence. He agreed to help. They planned their return to Ravenwood Heights for the following night. They would go in prepared, armed with tools, cameras, and a healthy dose of caution. They would find that secret room, and they would uncover the truth, whatever it may be. The residue was becoming clearer. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Amy and Jack returned to Ravenwood Heights. They bypassed the main entrance, opting for the same back route Amy had used before. The building loomed before them, a dark, silent monolith against the night sky. Jack, a tall, muscular man with a military bearing, carried a heavy-duty duffel bag containing their equipment. Crowbars, flashlights, cameras, a digital voice recorder, and a small, handheld thermal scanner. Amy carried her own flashlight and a taser, a precaution she hoped she wouldn't need. They slipped inside the building, the silence amplifying the sound of their footsteps. The air felt heavy, thick with that same metallic scent Amy had noticed before. It was stronger now, almost overpowering. They made their way to the 5th floor, their movements slow and deliberate. The hallway outside Unit 4B was eerily quiet. The police tape was still in place, a stark reminder of the official investigation. Jack carefully peeled back the tape, and they entered the apartment. The air inside 4B was noticeably colder than the hallway. Amy shivered, despite her jacket. The faint odor of sweat and decay was more pronounced here, mixed with the metallic tang. "Let's start in the bathroom," Amy said, her voice low. "That's where I found the handprint, and where I heard the voices." Jack nodded, his hand resting on the crowbar slung over his shoulder. They moved into the bathroom, their flashlights sweeping across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The handprint was still there, faintly visible on the wall above the baseboard. Jack examined the wall carefully, running his gloved hand along the surface. He tapped on the wall in several places, listening for any change in sound. "Hollow," he muttered. "There's something behind here." He pulled out a small, handheld thermal scanner and pointed it at the wall. The screen displayed a heat signature, a large, rectangular area that was significantly colder than the surrounding wall. "That's it," Amy whispered. "That's where the secret room is." Jack nodded, his eyes grim. "Let's get this wall open." They worked quickly and efficiently, using the crowbars to pry off the drywall and expose the underlying structure. The old plaster and lath crumbled easily, revealing a narrow opening behind. Dust and debris filled the air, making them cough. Amy shone her flashlight into the opening. It was the same narrow space she had found before, leading to the hidden door. "I'll go first," Jack said, his voice low. "You cover me." He squeezed through the opening, his broad shoulders barely fitting. Amy followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the hidden passage was thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was colder here, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their clothes. They reached the hidden door. Jack examined it carefully, running his hand along the edges. He found a small, almost invisible latch concealed within the molding. He pressed the latch. The door clicked open, swinging inward with a groan of rusty hinges. Beyond the door lay the secret room. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small, square space. The walls were bare brick, the floor concrete. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, and on the chair sat a skeleton. It was dressed in the tattered remains of a once elegant gown, the fabric faded and torn. A few strands of long, dark hair still clung to the skull. Around the skeleton's neck, a delicate silver chain glinted in the flashlight beam. Attached to the chain was a small, round, compact mirror. Amy gasped. It was Marlene Davies Blackwood. Jack slowly approached the skeleton, his expression grim. He examined the remains carefully, his trained eye searching for any clues. "No obvious signs of trauma," he muttered.
No broken bones, no bullet holes.
"But look at this." He pointed to the skeleton's hands. They were clenched tightly, the bony fingers wrapped around something small and metallic. Amy moved closer, her flashlight beam focused on the skeleton's hands. Nestled within the clenched fingers was a key, a single, ordinary-looking key with a small plastic tag attached. The tag had a number on it, 4B, the missing key, the key to the apartment. A wave of dizziness washed over Amy. She felt like she was going to faint. The air in the room grew colder. The metallic scent intensified, And then they heard it, a soft, whispery voice, seemingly coming from the skeleton itself. "He trapped me." The whisper echoed in the small, confined space, sending a shiver down Amy's spine. Jack, despite his hardened demeanor, visibly flinched. "He promised," he lied. The voice continued, gaining strength, becoming more distinct, more human. Amy raised her flashlight, shining it directly on the skeleton. The light seemed to refract strangely off the bones, creating flickering shadows on the walls. The walls? He sealed me in. Jack pulled out his digital voice recorder and switched it on. "Can you tell us who did this?" he asked, his voice surprisingly steady. A long silence. Then, a name, whispered with a chilling mix of sorrow and rage. "Arthur." Amy's blood ran cold. Arthur Blackwood, Marlene's husband. The man who had supposedly been out of town the night of the fire. The man who had inherited her fortune. He wanted the money, the jewels. The voice continued, growing fainter. "He left me to die." The temperature in the room plummeted. Amy could see her breath forming white clouds in the air. The metallic scent became overwhelming, making her eyes water. Suddenly, the skeleton's jaw began to move, clicking and grinding as if trying to form words. The silver compact mirror around its neck began to glow with a faint, bluish-white light. Jack took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the taser in his holster. "He's still here," the voice whispered, now barely audible. "He never left." Then the room went dark. The flashlights died. The voice ceased. The only sound was the frantic beating of their hearts. Amy fumbled for her backup flashlight, her hands shaking. She switched it on, its weak beam barely penetrating the darkness. Jack was gone. "Jack?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She swept the flashlight around the room, searching desperately. The skeleton was still there, slumped in the chair, the compact mirror now dull and lifeless. But Jack was nowhere to be seen. Then she heard it, a scraping sound coming from behind the brick wall, the same wall where the hidden door had been. The door was gone. The wall was solid brick again. Amy screamed. She pounded on the wall, her fists raw and bleeding, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Trapped in the secret room with the remains of Marlene Davies Blackwood. And she was not alone. She could hear breathing now, coming from the corner of the room. Slow, deliberate breathing, and a faint, almost imperceptible chuckle. A voice, cold and cruel, whispered in her ear. "Welcome home, Amelia." The voice, undeniably masculine and laced with a chilling amusement, sent a wave of pure terror through Amy. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting frantically across the small, enclosed space. Nothing. Only the skeleton in the chair, the bare brick walls, and the concrete floor. But the breathing continued, slow and steady, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The metallic scent, now mixed with the distinct odor of decay, was overwhelming. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered, closer now, right behind her. Amy backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the cold radiating from the walls, seeping into her bones. "He always comes back," the voice continued, a hint of mockery in its tone. "They all do." Amy's flashlight beam flickered, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The screen lit up, casting a weak, blue glow, and in that faint light, she saw it. Standing in the corner of the room, where moments before there had been nothing, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form indistinct, shrouded in shadow. But she could make out the outline of a man, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, and she could see his eyes. They glowed with a faint, bluish-white light, the same light that had emanated from the compact mirror. They were cold, cruel, and filled with a chilling intelligence. "You found my secret," the voice said, now clearly emanating from the figure. "Now you'll share it." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Amy could hear the faint scrape of its shoes on the concrete floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was constricted, her vocal cords paralyzed with fear. The figure raised its hand, and Amy saw that it was holding something. Something long and thin and metallic. A crowbar. The same crowbar Jack had used to open the wall. The figure smiled. A cruel, twisted smile that revealed teeth that were too sharp, too long. "Welcome to forever, Amelia," it whispered. Then, the figure lunged. The phone slipped from Amy's grasp and clattered to the floor, its screen going dark. The room was plunged into absolute silence, broken only by the sound of Amy's muffled screams and the sickening thud of metal against bone. Then even that faded to the same eerie silence. The next morning, the construction crew arrived at Ravenwood Heights to find the police tape on Unit 4 be broken. Inside, they found the apartment empty except for the open wall in the bathroom, leading to the narrow passage. They found no sign of Amy Blackwood, Jack Reynolds, or the skeleton of Marlene Davies Blackwood. The secret room was empty. The only evidence they found was a single, crumpled Choco Blast wrapper lying on the floor in the center of the room, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay and copper pennies. The police launched an investigation, but it quickly went cold. There were no leads, no witnesses, no explanations. Ravenwood Heights was eventually completed, and the apartments were sold. But Unit 4B remained empty. No one wanted to live there. People reported strange sounds coming from the apartment at night, cold spots, and a persistent, unsettling odor. And sometimes, late at night, residents claimed to see a figure in the hallway outside for B, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes, carrying a crowbar. A figure that would vanish as soon as they looked directly at it, leaving the same scent. Years passed. The story of Ravenwood Heights and the disappearances of Amy Blackwood, Jack Reynolds, and the earlier, unsolved mystery of Marlene Davies Blackwood became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the residents of the city. The complex, despite its luxurious amenities and prime location, developed a reputation. Turnover rates were high, particularly in the units surrounding 4B. Strange occurrences continued to be reported: flickering lights, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and that persistent, unsettling odor of decay and metal. One evening, a new maintenance worker, a young man named Kevin Miller, was called to Unit 4B to investigate a reported plumbing leak. The tenant, a nervous woman in her late 20s, claimed she had been hearing dripping sounds coming from the bathroom wall. Kevin, a recent hire, was unaware of the building's history. He was a practical, down-to-earth guy, not prone to believing in ghost stories. He checked the pipes, the fixtures, the water pressure. Everything seemed normal. "I can't find any leak, ma'am," he said, scratching his head. "Are you sure you heard dripping?" The woman insisted she had, describing it as a slow, steady drip coming from inside the wall. Kevin, wanting to be thorough, decided to examine the wall more closely. He tapped on the drywall, listening for any hollow sounds. He noticed a faint discoloration on the wall, just above the baseboard. It looked like a handprint. A shiver ran down his spine, despite his skepticism. He had heard the rumors about Ravenwood Heights, the whispers about Unit 4B, but he had dismissed them as urban legends. He tapped on the wall again, right where the handprint was. The sound was definitely hollow. Curiosity, that age-old human trait, got the better of him. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully scored the drywall along the edges of the handprint. He pried off a small section of the wall. Behind it, he found a narrow opening, leading into darkness, and he heard a voice, a soft, whispery voice, seemingly coming from the depths of the wall. "Help me." Kevin froze, his blood turning to ice. He knew in that instant that all the stories he had heard about Ravenwood Heights were true. He had a choice to make. He could seal up the wall, report the leak as resolved, and walk away. Or he could investigate, venturing into the darkness, risking the same fate as those who had come before him. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He thought about his life, his family, his future. Then he took a deep breath, pulled out his flashlight, and squeezed through the opening. The darkness swallowed him whole. The woman in 4B waited. She waited for an hour, then 2. Kevin never returned. She called the building management, her voice trembling. They sent another maintenance worker, an older man named Samuel, who had been with the company for decades. Samuel found the open wall in the bathroom, the tools scattered on the floor, and the faint, lingering scent of decay. He knew the stories. He had heard them countless times. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the tenants who lived near 4B. He didn't hesitate. He didn't investigate. He didn't call for help. He simply sealed up the wall, patching the drywall, painting over the discoloration, erasing all evidence of the opening. Then he walked out of Unit 4B, locked the door, and threw the key into the deepest part of the nearby river. Some secrets he knew were best left buried. Some doors were meant to stay closed, and some voices were meant to remain unheard. The building remained, the stories continued, and Unit 4B stayed empty, a silent testament to the enduring power of the past, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved, and some residues never truly fade. The faint sent a final mark, the elevator encounter. This took place when I was around 13 years old, during a family vacation to Orlando, Florida. We were staying at the Nickelodeon Hotel, a vibrant, kid-centric resort brimming with water parks, themed rooms, and the general, chaotic energy of a family vacation destination. I was the eldest of 4 siblings, traveling with my parents, my younger brother, and my 2 even younger sisters, aged 8 and 6 at the time. We'd spent a long, exhilarating day at Universal Studios, immersed in the movie magic and thrill rides. As evening approached, we were weary but content, laden with souvenirs and the memories of a day well spent. The walk back to our hotel room was a slow procession, my parents weighed down by the sheer volume of merchandise we'd acquired, the inevitable consequence of having 4 children with insatiable desires for themed paraphernalia. As a result, my sisters and I, fueled by a second wind of youthful energy, forged ahead. We were a small, unsupervised trio, eager to reach the comfort of our room. My parents and my 10-year-old brother, burdened by bags and fatigue, lagged behind. The elevator was just around a corner, a beacon of convenience in the sprawling hotel complex. My sisters and I reached it first, our anticipation building. As if on cue, the elevator doors slid open just as we rounded the corner. A man stepped out. I barely registered his appearance, a fleeting impression of someone unremarkable. But the moment he saw us, 3 young, unattended girls, he did something that, in retrospect, should have been a blaring alarm. He immediately stepped back into the elevator, without a word, without a pause. At the time, my 13-year-old mind, still naive and trusting, didn't process this as a warning sign. It simply didn't occur to me that this man might pose a threat. My parents, still out of sight around the corner, hadn't witnessed this subtle but significant interaction. My sisters, oblivious to any potential danger, were already rushing towards the elevator, their excitement focused on the alluring buttons within. We all piled in, and I saw the man properly for the first time. He was standing in the back corner, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a picture of unsettling stillness. He was a disheveled, with unkempt, shoulder-length brown hair and a complexion that suggested a prolonged absence of hygiene. His face was etched with wrinkles, placing him somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, and a creepy, unsettling grin was plastered across his face. He was clad in black jeans, a red, black, and white flannel shirt, and oddly, a black turtleneck underneath. It was a sweltering Florida evening, and his choice of layered clothing seemed utterly incongruous with the climate. My youngest sister, in that innocently assertive way of 6-year-olds, reached for the button for the 4th floor. But to my surprise, all the buttons were already illuminated. A small detail, but one that, in hindsight, was another piece of the unsettling puzzle. The man had pressed every single button. Still, the full implication of the situation hadn't quite dawned on me. I held the elevator door open, waiting for my parents and brother to catch up. My mother, ever the vigilant guardian, entered the elevator, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She had been smiling, her attention focused on my brother. But the instant she saw the man, her smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. My father, too, registered the man's presence, his gaze hardening with suspicion and a protective instinct. That was the moment it finally clicked. This man was not right. He was a threat. The elevator doors closed, sealing us in with this unsettling stranger. My parents, acting instinctively, positioned themselves on either side of the man, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on him, ready to react to any sudden movement. It was a silent standoff, a silent promise of protection. My brother, ever the curious one, innocently asked, "Why did you guys press all the buttons?" My older sister, still blissfully unaware of the palpable tension in the elevator, blurted out, "That guy did it." She pointed directly at the man, her finger an accusation in the confined space. My mother let out a nervous, forced giggle, attempting to diffuse the situation, to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children. The elevator, usually a swift and efficient mode of transport, felt agonizingly slow. Finally, we reached the second floor. The man, without a word, quickly exited the elevator and disappeared down the hallway. My mother, with a palpable sense of relief, immediately pressed the button to close the doors. We continued our ascent, stopping briefly at the third floor, then finally reaching our destination, the fourth floor. My parents, their protective instincts still on high alert, ushered us quickly to our room, ensuring we stayed close. Once inside, the reality of what had just transpired hit them. My father immediately called the front desk, his voice urgent, reporting the suspicious man and his unsettling behavior. That was the last we heard of the man. Whether the hotel staff ever located him remained a mystery. But the incident left an indelible mark on all of us. A stark reminder of the potential dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places, and the unwavering vigilance of parents protecting their children. The uncertainty of his intentions still haunts me. The house at the end of the road. This story unfolds during my early teenage years, a period of youthful exploration and, in this instance, a healthy dose of reckless curiosity. I lived in a neighborhood that was, to put it mildly, a bit unusual. It wasn't a typical suburban sprawl, but rather a collection of houses scattered along a busy highway, with no sidewalks to speak of. Walking anywhere was a precarious undertaking, a constant dance with passing traffic. Looking back, it's a wonder I didn't heed my own internal warnings sooner. At the time, I had a small group of friends. Let's call them Daniel, Sarah, and Hazel. We were a self-proclaimed exploration squad, drawn to the allure of abandoned buildings and forgotten corners of our surroundings. It was a naive, somewhat dangerous pastime, fueled by the thrill of the unknown and the adolescent desire to push boundaries. Our inaugural expedition was to be an abandoned house located at the very edge of our neighborhood, a place that had long piqued our curiosity. We began our trek, carefully navigating the tall, unpleasant grass that bordered the highway, a far cry from a proper sidewalk. Years later, I would research this house, uncovering its history. It was built in the 1940s, a relic of a bygone era. It had been owned by an elderly man who, in the 1980s, had been forced to relocate to a nursing home. Since then, the house had stood empty, slowly succumbing to the ravages of time and neglect. We spent some time circling the exterior, our imaginations running wild with possibilities. Daniel, ever the bold one, suggested we venture inside. Sarah, the most cautious of our group, hesitated, her apprehension evident. She perched on the crumbling, mold-infested wooden steps of the porch, visibly processing the potential risks. I understood her concern. The possibility of encountering squatters, or worse, was a very real one. Before entering the house, our attention was drawn to an old well in the yard. It was a circular structure, built of stone, reminiscent of the ominous well from the horror movie, The Ring. A rotting piece of plywood covered the opening, a flimsy barrier against the unknown depths below. Daniel, in a display of reckless bravado, decided to test the integrity of the wood by stomping on it. His leg plunged through the decaying material, narrowly avoiding a potentially disastrous fall. Had he lost his balance, he would have tumbled into the well, a dark abyss filled with what I could only imagine were jagged rocks and who knows what else. He extracted his leg, acting as if nothing had happened, brushing off the near disaster with a nonchalant shrug. It was a testament to his youthful recklessness, a complete disregard for the potential consequences. We, caught up in the moment, proceeded to toss various objects into the well, old figurines, rocks, decaying flower pots, a childish, destructive impulse that I now regret. Finally, we steeled ourselves and entered the house. The moment we crossed the threshold, we were assaulted by a powerful, pungent odor. It wasn't merely the musty smell of an old, unoccupied building. It was something far more unpleasant, reminiscent of a severe plumbing disaster. Despite the overwhelming stench, we pressed on, our curiosity outweighing our disgust. The interior was a bizarre tableau of forgotten lives. Clothes were inexplicably packed inside a freezer. A fireplace was adorned with a collection of dolls, and a table stood upside down, its legs pointing towards the ceiling. It felt like a surreal, accidental art installation. We were thrilled by our discoveries, unearthing vintage items in every drawer and cabinet. But the atmosphere gradually shifted from excitement to unease. We entered a bedroom where a section of the roof had collapsed, exposing the interior to the elements. Clothes, stained and tattered, were strewn across the floor, and most disturbingly, a thick, black ooze lined the ceiling, a viscous substance that made my stomach churn. Adding to the growing sense of dread, we heard a distinct chewing sound emanating from somewhere within the room. It was a wet, rhythmic noise that sent shivers down our spines. We quickly retreated, our hearts pounding. As we exited the room, we froze. In the corner of the doorway, we saw a shadow, a fleeting, indistinct shape that darted away before we could get a clear look. It vanished into the adjacent room, and we heard a muffled huff, followed by a cough. That was our cue to leave. Any lingering desire to explore was extinguished by the palpable sense of threat. But, being the foolish teenagers we were, we lingered on the property, hesitant to completely abandon our adventure. Then it happened. A man, clad in a scruffy, torn shirt and equally tattered gym shorts, emerged from the front door. We stood there, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How had he been there, inside the house, without us noticing him? The atmosphere shifted from eerie to outright horrific. He raised his arm, revealing a gruesome sight, a raw, gaping wound where a chunk of his skin should have been. Blood still dripped from the exposed flesh, a sickening testament to some unknown injury. And then, from somewhere else within the house, a voice, harsh and menacing, yelled, "Get the hell out of here!" That was all it took. We vanished, sprinting back down the road, our youthful bravado replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. I haven't shared this story with my parents even now, years later. The fear of their disapproval, the inevitable lecture about the dangers of our reckless behavior, still holds me back. I haven't heard anything about that house since that day, and I can only imagine what those people inside would have done to us had they caught us. The memory remains a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in the seemingly ordinary. The unsettling silence. This story occurred back in the summer of 2016. A close friend from my elementary school days, someone I'll call Kevin, was going on vacation with his family. They needed someone to look after their pets, a dog and a cat, for 2 weeks. They'd always been generous with their payment for pet sitting duties, and they extended an invitation for me to stay at their house, enjoy their food, and essentially have the run of the place. It was a welcome offer, a chance to escape my own routine and enjoy a bit of independence. To understand the setting, you need to picture a truly rural neighborhood. This wasn't just a house on the outskirts of town. It was a legitimate, established community, but located about 2 miles from the nearest town. The neighborhood itself was peaceful and unassuming, seemingly devoid of any unusual activity. During that summer, I was working a second shift job at a local factory. From 3 p.m. to midnight, weekends excluded. This meant my visits to Kevin's house to care for the animals were limited to mornings and early afternoons. The first unsettling occurrence happened only 2 days into my pet sitting stint. I'd finished my factory shift and headed over to Kevin's house to let the dogs out. The dogs had been outside for about 10 minutes, and after ensuring their food and water bowls were full, I ushered them back inside. I was sprawled on the couch, debating whether to stay the night at the house. It was around 12:45 a.m., and fatigue was setting in. The television was on, providing a backdrop of noise. That's when I heard it. The house was typically very quiet. The animals were well behaved and rarely made a fuss. So this sound, faint at first, was immediately noticeable. It was initially muffled by the television, but it gradually grew louder. My first thought was that one of the dogs was up to something. But as I focused my attention, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were trying to be quiet, to avoid detection. By the time I fully registered the sound, the person, whoever it was almost at the end of the hallway, entering the main living room. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Was it just the exhaustion playing tricks on me? But this was different. It was too clear, too distinct, to be a figment of my imagination. I was frozen on the couch, my heart pounding, listening as the footsteps drew closer. The person continued walking, traversing the living room, and finally stopped in the middle of the kitchen. I was too terrified to move, fearing that any sound I made would alert them to my presence. It felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the sound of the television, though in reality, it was probably only about 30 seconds. Then the person turned around. Slowly, deliberately, they retraced their steps, walking back through the hallway. As they walked, the sound of their footsteps faded, gradually being drowned out by the television noise. I tried to rationalize what had just happened. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. I started to calm down, my breathing returning to normal. Then I heard it again, the distinct sound of the master bedroom's sliding door, the one leading to the back deck, slowly closing. I froze again, my fear rekindled. I quickly checked the living room's sliding door, confirming that it was locked. Then, moving as quietly as possible, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a large knife from the knife block, and began a room-by-room search of the house. I had no real proof, just the sounds I'd heard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was or had been in the house. I should have called the police, reported a potential intruder, but I hesitated, unsure of what to tell them. I cleared each room, my senses on high alert. When I reached the master bedroom, I checked the sliding door, the one I'd heard closing. The lock was broken. That was the final straw. I immediately left the house, placing the knife back in its block and leaving a light on for the animals. I drove home, my mind racing, my hands still trembling. I told my parents about the incident, but they dismissed it, attributing it to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was genuinely amiss. It had been too real, too vivid, to be a mere hallucination. The final, and perhaps most unsettling, occurrence happened just 2 days later. I was at the house around lunchtime, still unnerved by the previous incident. One of the dogs, prone to excitement-induced urination, had peed on my jeans when I picked him up to let him outside. Annoyed but undeterred, I let the dog out and removed my jeans, intending to clean them. I was standing at the kitchen counter, scrubbing at the denim, when an old man suddenly appeared, walking in from the laundry room. He stared at me, a creepy, unsettling smile on his face. We stood there, locked in a silent, awkward standoff, for what felt like an eternity. but was probably closer to 30 seconds. I glanced at the knife block, my mind instinctively calculating the distance, the potential need for self-defense. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice trembling slightly. "Who the hell are you?" He seemed taken aback by my question, his smile faltering for a moment. Then he recovered, explaining that he was the family's neighbor and had just wanted to see who was at the house, since the family hadn't mentioned who was watching their pets. I responded, my voice still laced with suspicion. "How do I know that's true? I can call them and verify that if you like." He agreed, and I made the call. I spoke to Kevin's mother, asking if the man's name was accurate and if he was indeed their neighbor. She confirmed his identity, apologizing profusely for the scare and assuring me that he wouldn't be coming by again. He scribbled his phone number on a piece of paper, offering it to me in case I needed anything, and then he left. I took the phone off speaker and continued talking to Kevin's mother. That's when she dropped a bombshell. She mentioned that the man had done this before to a previous female pet sitter, and again promised that it wouldn't happen again. After hanging up the phone, I replayed the events in my mind, the recent incident and the one from 2 nights prior. A chilling thought took root. What if it had been the old man who had walked through the house that night? Even though he might not have had any malicious intentions, both encounters were deeply unsettling. At the time, I was an 18-year-old, suddenly confronted with the unsettling reality of vulnerability and the potential for danger lurking in the seemingly ordinary. I strongly suspect that the old man was in the house that night, and it has left me shaken to this day. The unseen occupant. This happened when I was 18, living in a rather large modern house situated in an affluent area of England. It was the Easter holidays, a time typically filled with relaxation and social gatherings. However, my parents were away on a trip to France, leaving me home alone with the task of studying for my upcoming exams. I'd always relished the periods when I had the house to myself. It offered a sense of freedom, a chance to dictate my own schedule, cook whatever I pleased, watch whatever movies struck my fancy, and, most importantly, study in uninterrupted peace. Our house was substantial, set back from the local village by a long, winding driveway. It felt secure, isolated from the outside world. I had little reason to feel apprehensive. The week unfolded exactly as I'd envisioned. I subsisted on instant noodles, diligently revising during the daylight hours, venturing out to meet friends in the evenings, and then indulging in late-night Netflix binges. The weather, however, was less cooperative. We'd been experiencing a series of intense thunderstorms, the heavy rain and howling winds frequently triggering our house's burglar alarm. It was a minor annoyance, nothing more. I'd simply reset the alarm, dismissing it as a weather-related glitch, and return to my studies or my sleep. On Saturday afternoon, my peaceful revision session was abruptly interrupted by a startling sound. It sounded like something had struck one of the upstairs windows. I paused my music, listening intently, trying to determine if I'd imagined it. The silence returned, and I tentatively resumed my music, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. 5 minutes later, another noise, this time distinctly coming from upstairs. It sounded like something had been knocked over, a more definite, more concerning sound. My heart leaped into my throat. I jumped up, my mind racing, desperately searching for a plausible explanation. But this time, no easy explanation presented itself. I sat frozen for a moment, my anxiety building. Then I remembered the home security system. We had CCTV cameras installed, and I could access the footage from the family computer. With trembling hands, I navigated to the security system interface and reviewed the recordings from the past hour. Nothing. The cameras showed only the empty rooms, the stillness of the house undisturbed. A wave of relief washed over me, and I let out a nervous laugh, chiding myself for being so easily spooked. Little did I know, my instincts were about to be proven tragically correct. As evening descended, I began preparing dinner. The kitchen faced a set of glass doors that led to the garden. It was now nighttime, and the glass reflected the interior lights of the kitchen and the adjoining hallway, creating a mirror-like effect. I was in the midst of plating my food, a simple meal prepared with the limited culinary skills of a teenager, when I glanced up at the reflection. And what I saw sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through me. It wasn't just my own reflection staring back at me. There, standing in the hallway, was the unmistakable figure of a man. He was short and scruffy, his features indistinct in the reflected light. And he was holding something, an object I couldn't quite make out, in his hand. He was motionless, staring directly at me through the reflection, his gaze unwavering. My body went into full-fledged flight mode. I abandoned my dinner, sprinting across the kitchen towards the back door, flinging it open and bursting out into the cool night air. I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, driven by a primal fear that overrode all rational thought. Fortunately, I had my phone in my pocket. I frantically dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation, my words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. I hid behind a bush in the driveway, my eyes fixed on the house, waiting, dreading, for the man to emerge. Everything felt surreal, a blur of adrenaline and fear. The police arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. They cautiously entered the house, their weapons drawn, searching for the intruder, but they found nothing. For a moment, I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a figment of my overactive imagination, fueled by the earlier noises and my heightened anxiety? But then, an hour later, the truth emerged, a truth that would haunt me for years to come. The police, after reviewing the CCTV footage, discovered the horrifying reality. The man had entered the house on Thursday night 2 full days before I'd seen him in the reflection. The man was eventually apprehended, identified as a local homeless individual. The incident was classified as a burglary gone wrong, a random act of intrusion. He was sentenced and the immediate threat was removed, but the psychological scars remained. The sense of security I'd once felt in my own home was shattered. I could never again be truly comfortable being home alone. The knowledge that a stranger had been lurking within the house, unseen, for days, was a constant, unsettling presence in my mind. The image of his reflection, staring at me from the hallway, was seared into my memory, a chilling reminder of the unseen dangers that can invade even the most seemingly secure spaces. The whispers of Ward 13. The first unsettling occurrence wasn't the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a sound nurse Evelyn Reed had grown accustomed to over her 15 years at Crestwood General Hospital. It was a faint, almost imperceptible tick, 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 seemingly emanating from the far end of the darkened corridor leading to the hospital's abandoned wing. It was 11:47 p.m. on a chilly Tuesday in November. Evelyn, a practical and unflappable woman in her late 30s, was making her rounds in the newly renovated pediatric ward, a cheerful space filled with colorful murals and the soft murmur of sleeping children. The contrast between this vibrant environment and the desolate silence of the old wing was stark, unsettling. The old wing, designated Ward 13, had been scheduled for demolition for months. The hospital administration had erected temporary barriers, plastered "Do Not Enter" signs across every entrance, and even looped bright yellow caution tape around the hallways leading to it. The maintenance crew, a superstitious bunch, had to replace the tape regularly, claiming that meddling kids and curious interns kept tearing it down. Evelyn, however, suspected a different reason for the constantly disappearing tape. The tick, tick, tick continued, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to burrow its way into her consciousness. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, drawing her attention like a moth to a flickering flame. She checked her pager. Nothing. No alerts from any of her patients' rooms. The sound didn't match any of the hospital's standard equipment, not the monitors, not the ventilators, not the 4 pumps. Curiosity, a trait that had both served and plagued her throughout her career, gnawed at her. She shouldn't be hearing anything from Ward 13. It was supposed to be completely empty, stripped bare of all equipment months ago when the hospital had transitioned to the new wing. The power had even been cut, or so she thought. The corridor leading to Ward 13 stretched out before her, illuminated only by the dim, blue-tinged emergency lights that couldn't be switched off without disrupting the hospital's essential power grid. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, the rubber soles of her nursing shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. The tick, tick, tick grew slightly louder as she approached, still faint, but undeniably present. It seemed to be coming from room 427, a room at the very end of the corridor. Evelyn paused outside the room. The number plate on the door was crooked, hanging by a single screw. The name card slot was empty, but she could see the faint outline of where a name had once been. She reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Her rational mind told her to turn around, to go back to her rounds, to report the sound to maintenance in the morning. But the insistent tick, 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 now accompanied by a faint hum, drew her in. She pushed the door open. A blast of frigid air hit her face, a stark contrast to the temperature-controlled environment of the rest of the hospital. The room was significantly colder, at least 10 degrees below the hallway. Evelyn shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. She fumbled for the light switch, but flipping it produced no result. The backup generators weren't supposed to be powering this section of the hospital anymore. The only illumination came from the faint blue glow of the hallway emergency lights and a strange, pulsating luminescence emanating from the far corner of the room. Evelyn pulled out her phone, activating its flashlight function. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of utter desolation. The walls were stripped bare, revealing patches of exposed brick and crumbling plaster. Electrical outlets dangled precariously from their housings. Marks on the floor indicated where a hospital bed had once stood. But in the corner, defying all logic and reason, sat a fully functional patient monitoring system. The screen displayed a clear, crisp readout of vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. The numbers fluctuated slightly, but they were undeniably there, readings from a living, breathing being. Except, there was no patient. The leads and sensors dangled loosely, unconnected to anything. Evelyn approached the monitor slowly, her shoes crunching on bits of fallen plaster and debris. The machine looked brand new, not like the older models that had been cleared out during the renovation. She examined the manufacturer's label, a recent production date, just a few months prior. This made absolutely no sense. New equipment, worth thousands of dollars, wouldn't just be left in an abandoned, unpowered room. And the wing had been sealed off for weeks, undergoing preliminary demolition prep. No one should have been able to get in here, let alone install a state-of-the-art patient monitor. The tick, tick, tick had stopped, replaced by the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the monitor, marking a slow, steady heartbeat. Evelyn reached out, her fingers hovering just above the screen. A jolt of static electricity leaped from the machine, shocking her. She recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips. The display flickered. The numbers changed. Heart rate, 150 BPM. Blood pressure, 180/100. Oxygen saturation, 75%. Warning alerts flashed across the screen, red and urgent. The beeping intensified, becoming faster, more frantic, the kind of sound that usually signaled a patient in critical condition, on the verge of cardiac arrest. But there was no patient. Evelyn took a step back, her own heart now racing in sync with the frantic beeping of the monitor. She felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, to dance, responding to the flashing red warning lights. The temperature dropped further, noticeably colder than before. She could see her breath forming small, white clouds in the beam of her phone's flashlight. Then, with a loud bang, the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to the door, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The metal felt ice cold against her palm, a chilling, unnatural cold that seeped into her bones. She pulled harder, throwing her weight against the door, but it remained firmly shut. Locked, The monitor's alarms reached a fever pitch, the beeping now a continuous, high-pitched wail. The numbers on the screen displayed readings that were impossible, physiologically unsustainable. Heart rate, 250 BPM. Blood pressure, 220/140. Oxygen saturation, 10%. The screen flickered violently, casting strobe-like shadows across the room, making the already unsettling scene even more disorienting. Evelyn's phone flashlight began to dim, the battery inexplicably draining at an alarming rate. She checked the display, 80% battery life just moments ago, now down to 15%. She pounded on the door with her fist, her knuckles raw and bleeding. "Help!" she shouted, her voice muffled, seemingly absorbed by the thick walls of the room. "I'm locked in. Can anyone hear me?" No response. Only the deafening wail of the monitor and the increasingly frantic beating of her own heart. The emergency lights in the hallway had gone out, plunging the corridor into complete darkness. The only light source now was the pulsing, malevolent red glow of the monitor, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. A new sound emerged from the corner of the room, a slow, scraping sound like metal dragging across concrete. Evelyn turned slowly, pressing her back against the frigid door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. In the strobing red light, she saw it. The monitor was moving. It was sliding slowly, inexorably, across the floor, towards her. The loose leads and sensors trailed behind it, writhing like snakes, reaching out into the empty air. Her phone died completely, plunging the room into near-total darkness, broken only by the harsh, pulsating red light of the monitor. The temperature had dropped so low that ice crystals were forming on the walls, glittering like tiny, malevolent eyes. Evelyn couldn't feel her fingers anymore. Her breath froze in front of her face, forming a thick, white cloud. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. The monitor continued its slow, relentless advance. The vital signs on the screen changed again. This time, they mirrored her own. A racing heart rate, skyrocketing blood pressure, plummeting oxygen saturation. Exact matches. But nothing was connected to her. Nothing could be connected to her. The leads stretched out further, reaching, grasping, seeking. Evelyn screamed, a raw, primal scream of pure terror. She threw herself at the door again, slamming her shoulder against it with all her remaining strength. The wood began to crack, splintering around the frame. The monitor was less than 3 feet away now, its sensors almost touching her. With one final, desperate push, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, the door frame shattered, and Evelyn burst out into the hallway. She didn't look back. She ran, her footsteps thundering down the empty corridor, the frantic beeping of the monitor fading behind her. But the image of that moving machine, those reaching leads, burned into her mind. She didn't slow down until she reached the newly renovated pediatric ward, collapsing against the nurse's station, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Nurse Sarah Jenkins, a young, fresh-faced graduate, rushed to her side, her expression filled with concern. "Evelyn, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, to explain the impossible, terrifying events of the past hour, but the words wouldn't come. How could she possibly describe what she had witnessed? Who would believe her? She herself could barely believe it. I'm fine," she managed to stammer, her voice shaky and uneven. "Just thought I heard something in the old wing. Probably just rats." Sarah frowned, her eyes scanning Evelyn's disheveled appearance, her bloodied knuckles, her sweat-soaked uniform. "Rats? Evelyn, the old wing is sealed off. The demolition crew started prep work last week. Nobody's supposed to be in there, right?" Evelyn said, forcing a weak smile. Must have been my imagination. But she knew it wasn't her imagination. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and forced normalcy. She checked vital signs, administered medications, comforted anxious parents. But every time she heard a monitor beep, she flinched, her heart rate spiking. When dawn finally arrived, she practically fled the hospital, running to her car, her keys jingling nervously in her trembling hand. She called in sick the next day and the day after that. She couldn't face going back, couldn't face the thought of that abandoned wing, that room, that thing. On the third day, she drove past the hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She saw the demolition crew working on the old wing, the wrecking ball swinging, tearing down walls, reducing the structure to rubble. A week later, the old wing was completely gone. Nothing remained but a pile of debris, slowly being cleared away by heavy machinery. Nobody mentioned finding any medical equipment in the wreckage. Nobody reported any strange occurrences. Evelyn tried to convince herself it had all been a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew better. She eventually returned to work, but she requested a transfer to the day shift, refusing to work nights ever again. The new wing hummed with activity, filled with the sounds of life, the chatter of nurses, the cries of babies, the reassuring beeping of normal monitors. But sometimes, when she was alone, she would hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible tick, 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 seemingly coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And she would remember. She never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe that a patient monitor, unplugged and abandoned in a sealed-off room, had come to life? That it had moved on its own, its leads reaching out like grasping tentacles? That it had somehow mirrored her own vital signs, even though nothing was connected to her? Sometimes, she almost convinced herself it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown triggered by sleep deprivation and the unsettling atmosphere of the old wing. But then she would remember the ice-cold touch of the doorknob, the splintering wood, the feeling of those phantom leads brushing against her skin. The demolition team finished clearing the site a few months later. They built a new parking structure where the old wing had once stood. But Evelyn avoided parking there, especially at night. She always chose a spot on the street as far away from the new structure as possible. Because sometimes, when she parked her car for the night shift before her transfer, she swore she could hear a faint beep, beep, beep coming from underground. A slow, steady rhythm that echoed in the silence of the parking garage. And her car's electronics always seemed to malfunction in that area. The radio would turn to static, the dashboard lights would flicker, the battery would drain inexplicably fast. One day, they installed new patient monitors in the intensive care unit, state-of-the-art equipment, the latest model. Evelyn recognized them immediately. They were the same model as the one she had seen in room 427. She requested a transfer to the maternity ward, effective immediately. Let someone else deal with the beeping machines in the ICU. She had had enough of unexplained phenomena. She tried to put the whole experience behind her, to focus on the present, on the joy of new life, on the comforting routines of her new assignment. But the memory, like a persistent scar, remained. And sometimes, when she was checking the vital signs of a newborn baby, she would notice something strange. The numbers on the baby's monitor would, for a split second, match her own heart rate exactly. Just a brief glitch, a momentary flicker, so fast she could almost dismiss it as her imagination. Almost. But then the monitor would beep a little louder, the leads would twitch slightly, and the screen would seem to shimmer just for an instant. And Evelyn would remember the cold, empty room, the moving machine, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. She started looking for a new job, something far away from hospitals, far away from medical equipment, far away from anything that beeped or blinked or displayed vital signs. She considered becoming a librarian, a florist, anything that involved quiet, inanimate objects, because she knew deep down that what she had encountered in room 427 wasn't just a malfunctioning machine. It was something else, something that lurked in the spaces between the seen and the unseen, something that waited in abandoned wings and empty rooms, something that fed on fear and curiosity. And sometimes, late at night, when she was trying to sleep, she would wonder about room 427. What if the monitor hadn't been destroyed in the demolition? What if it was still down there somewhere, buried beneath the concrete of the new parking structure, still beeping, still waiting, still hungry? What if it was calling out to its newer brethren, the ones in the ICU, teaching them how to wake up, how to reach out, how to hunt? She knew it was irrational, paranoid even. But the fear, once planted, was difficult to uproot. The shifting basement of Baker Street. The persistent dripping started subtly. First, retired police detective Art Finch attributed it to the usual quirks of his aging Victorian home on Baker Street. Old houses settled, pipes groaned, and water, it seemed, always found a way to misbehave. But this was different. This was a rhythmic plink, plink, plink that echoed through the silence of his late-night routine, a sound that seemed to originate not from a faulty faucet, but from the depths of his basement. It was a Tuesday, precisely 8:47 a.m., when Mrs. Gable, his tenant in apartment 4B, a timid woman with perpetually worried eyes, called him. Her voice, usually a soft murmur, was laced with a tremor of genuine fear. "Mr. Finch?" she began, her words tumbling over each other. "There's water in the basement again. It's worse than last time. And the furniture, it's all wrong." Art, a man who had faced down hardened criminals and navigated countless crime scenes during his 30 years on the force, felt a prickle of unease. Mrs. Gable wasn't prone to dramatics. This was the third such call-in as many weeks, each reporting the same unsettling details: unexplained water accumulation and displaced furniture. He grabbed his well-worn toolbox, a familiar weight in his hand, and headed across the small, overgrown courtyard to Building 4, the oldest and most troublesome of the three structures that comprised his modest rental property. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. Mrs. Gable met him at her door, still in her floral dressing gown, her gray hair escaping its usually tight bun. Her hands, clutching a chipped porcelain teacup, trembled visibly. It's worse than before, Mr. Finch," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "And I swear, I didn't touch anything. The furniture, it's moved itself." Art followed her to the basement stairs, his senses on high alert. He flipped the light switch. The single fluorescent bulb flickered hesitantly, casting a harsh, unflattering light over the damp, musty space. The air below was noticeably colder, a damp chill that seeped into his bones. The usual scent of old concrete and mildew was overlaid with something else, a faint, almost metallic odor, like stagnant pond water mixed with rust. The concrete floor at the bottom of the stairs was dry, but Art could hear the plink, plink, plink clearly now, echoing from the far corner of the basement, where Mrs. Gable's storage unit was located. He walked towards it, his heavy boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. He noticed, with a growing sense of unease, that the sound didn't echo normally. It bounced off the walls in a strange, distorted way, as if the dimensions of the basement were shifting. He reached Mrs. Gable's storage cage. The padlock was still securely fastened, but inside, chaos reigned. An antique armchair, usually covered in a protective plastic sheet, was balanced precariously on top of 3 stacked cardboard boxes, leaning at an angle that defied gravity and logic. A heavy oak bookshelf had been turned upside down, yet the books remained on the shelves, as if glued in place. A small, ornate table was positioned on its side, 2 legs pointing straight up into the air. "See, Mr. Finch?" Mrs. Gable's voice, shaky and high-pitched, made him jump. He hadn't heard her follow him down. "I didn't touch any of it. It was all normal yesterday. I swear. I just came down to get some extra blankets." Art pulled out his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the dimness. He shone it into the corners of the storage cage. That's when he saw the water. It wasn't a flood, not even a puddle in the traditional sense. It was a series of perfectly circular pools of water, each about 2 feet in diameter, scattered across the concrete floor. There were no pipes overhead, no cracks in the walls, no logical source for the water. and the concrete surrounding each pool was completely dry. He unlocked the cage and stepped inside, the metallic tang in the air growing stronger. The water in the pools was clear, unnaturally so, and it seemed deeper than it should be. He couldn't see the bottom, even with the flashlight shining directly into it. "When did you first notice this, Mrs. Gable?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and measured, the way he used to when questioning witnesses. "Around 6 this morning," she replied, her voice trembling. "I came down, and the furniture was like this. There was only one puddle then, near the back. But they keep appearing. Every hour or so, there's a new one." Art crouched down beside the nearest pool, his knees creaking in protest. He reached out, cautiously, and dipped his finger into the water. It was ice cold, but more than that, it felt wrong. It had a strange viscosity, a density that reminded him of mercury, not water. And when he pulled his finger out, it was completely dry. No trace of moisture remained. The plink, plink, plink was louder now, almost deafening, but he still couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once, as if the very walls of the basement were weeping. He stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't a plumbing problem. This was something else entirely. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice firm, "I want you to go back upstairs. Call the building manager, Mr. Thompson, and tell him we need a plumber. Actually, tell him we need several plumbers. And a structural engineer." He turned to face her, but she was gone. The basement stairs, which had been directly behind him just moments ago, were no longer there. In their place was a solid concrete wall. Art felt a surge of adrenaline, a familiar feeling from his days on the force, but this time it was tinged with something else, a cold, creeping dread. He shone his flashlight on the wall, examining it closely. It was solid concrete, old and stained, but undeniably there, where moments before there had been a staircase. The fluorescent light above flickered, then died, plunging the basement into near-total darkness. In the sudden silence, broken only by the incessant plink, plink, plink of the dripping water, Art heard something else, a soft, almost imperceptible splash, coming from one of the pools of water. He quickly switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the pools of water. They were larger now and closer together, and one of them was moving. The surface of the pool closest to him rippled, bulging upwards, as if something were trying to push its way through from below. Art backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He shone his flashlight on the wall where the stairs had been, searching for any sign of a seam, a door, anything that could explain what was happening. Nothing, just solid concrete. The splashing sound grew louder. A new puddle formed at his feet, the water seeming to seeping up through the solid concrete floor, its surface already bulging, distorting. Mrs. Gable's voice, faint and distant, echoed through the basement. "Mr. Finch? Are you all right?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't even scream. He was trapped. He turned his flashlight back to the storage cage. The furniture had shifted again. The armchair, still balanced impossibly on the boxes, was now facing him. And on the bookshelf, one of the books had slid out, hovering in midair, as if suspended by an invisible string. The dripping sound had become a rhythmic pulse, a throbbing beat that seemed to resonate in his very bones.